56th birthday, and one of the presents he got was a warm reception from voters in Michigan, including some auto workers. What the president really wants is Michigan's 21 electoral votes, but at this moment it's not sure where they'll go. Judy Woodruff was with the presidential campaign today.
Michigan's unemployment rate is 14%, but the president's first stop was a Ford motor plant where no one's out of work. Most Ford plants aren't geared up to make the small gas-saving cars consumers now demand, but this one just outside Detroit does, and that's what the president came to dramatize. His speech to the auto workers sounded like a TV commercial for American cars.
There's not a better built, safer, more durable, or more efficient car today than these new American models, and the American buyers ought to remember that because it's important to us all.
After cutting a cake for his 56th birthday, the president headed for Flint, another blue-collar area he needs to do well in. But the jobless rate here is 23%, the highest in the country, and protesters outside a town meeting were one sign victory won't come easy.
George Bush said that I didn't have the guts to come here. It doesn't take any guts to come here with friends who share with me a hope for the future.
Mr. Carter heard firsthand from workers who want to expand jobless benefits.
And I see no need for a person to lose their homes and their family if it can be helped. We're dependent on you.
If you would give one of my aides, Keach, your name and telephone number, let me go back and talk to the Secretary of Labor and give you a call.
Whether that means administration policy will be reconsidered is another matter. Although it has been the policies of his own administration to restrain federal spending and to refuse to restrict foreign imports that have helped to contribute to the rising number of people out of work, Mr. Carter accepted no responsibility today for the high unemployment rate, blaming it instead on outside forces such as the rising cost of foreign oil. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Flint, Michigan.
While Carter was in the Middle West, Ronald Reagan was in the East, in cities which often vote Democratic. In Paterson, New Jersey, Reagan was heckled, but in New York, things were a little better. Reagan has not always been popular with New Yorkers, and today he was trying hard to make peace. Chris Wallace reports.
Reagan continued an effort to erase his anti-New York reputation, announcing for the second time in 5 days support for federal aid to the city. At a Manhattan construction site, Reagan came out for a $1 billion highway project, which he said has been held up by environmentalists in the Carter administration.
If I get the job I'm looking for, next January, I will be appointing a new administrator to the Environmental Protection Agency.
The construction workers gave Reagan a good reception, and he responded, at one point causing aides to groan.
You know, I got a pinhead. I'm afraid this is too big. Okay, whoops. Hey. Well, now, to prove I'm the Gipper.
Reagan has not always been so friendly to New York. In 1975, he opposed federal loans to the city, a position the Carter campaign has advertised on subways and buses. But this weekend, Reagan urged Congress to reject a cut in New York loan guarantees, saying the city is putting its finances in order. He denies an election year conversion.
I converted long before the election year, and I think that this is going forward, and I think it's going to revitalize this city, and I'm all for it.
Reagan hasn't changed, aides say. Conditions have. And in any case, they don't think his new positions will be a problem. One advisor said people are selfish. All they care about is what Reagan will do for them now. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in New York.
John Anderson was in the West, talking angrily about one of the crucial problems in his independent candidacy, money. To be precise, his inability to borrow money. The Federal Election Commission has ruled that Anderson would be eligible for several $1 million in public funds if he gets more than 5% of the vote in November. That should have made it possible for him to borrow, but not. He blames the Carter campaign for trying to block the loans. Bob Jameson has more.
Anderson charged that the Carter campaign is trying to pressure bankers not to loan him money he badly needs to buy television time.
The Democratic National Committee has prepared a memorandum, and that has been conveniently leaked into print so that it could come to the attention of banking institutions, a letter or memorandum that purports to warn of legal problems that would arise if my application for loans now pending before various banks, loans to the campaign, were to be considered favorably.
Aides said the memo warned that the loans, with the promise of federal funds after the election as collateral, might be illegal campaign contributions. The Federal Election Commission will rule on that question tomorrow. Anderson said it is part of a new White House offensive to end his campaign.
I think the Carter operatives are, in fact, by what they are saying and doing, admitting at last that the president cannot win this election.
As Anderson spoke to the Planned Parenthood Federation, aides in Washington were continuing negotiations with the banks. They expect the Federal Election Commission to rule in their favor and believe a loan package, something more than $3 million, will be announced next week. They then plan a lawsuit against the White House. Bob Jameson, NBC News, with the Anderson campaign in Denver.
Banks charge their best customers in less than a week. The high rates make money more expensive to borrow, slow the recovery from recession, and give the Republicans a chance to complain about the administration's economic record, as Ronald Reagan did today. Chris Wallace was there.
With interest rates rising again, Reagan today launched a new attack on Carter economic policies. Campaigning in Green Bay, Wisconsin, Reagan said high interest rates had caused a crisis in American housing.
I got up this morning and got on the airplane and learned that they're already now up to 14%. Just another half a point since yesterday. We'll go right back on Jimmy Carter's roller coaster, heading for another term of wildly tight credit and unavailable mortgage loans.
Some Reagan aides feel interest rates and other economic figures will decide the election, that voters will blame Mr. Carter for any problems. Earlier at a Pittsburgh steel plant, Reagan explained his plan for the troubled steel industry. Tax advantages, delays in environmental regulations, and prohibitions against dumping foreign steel here. The problem is Mr. Carter announced an almost identical plan 2 days ago. Reagan aides passed out press releases from mid-September to show their man came up with the plan first. And Reagan accused the president of follow-the-leader politics. He also warned steelworkers not to be fooled by campaign announcements.
This administration's policies for 3.5 years have crippled the steel industry. Now with the election nearing, he has a change of heart. If he's re-elected, will his promises to you in September be forgotten in December?
The Reagan camp acknowledged some workers won't care whose idea it was, or that Mr. Carter advanced it in a campaign. But as one aide said, what would you have us do? Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Pittsburgh.
President Carter was in Ohio, and among other things, he had some things himself to say about interest rates. Judy Woodruff reports.
Campaigning late today in the Philadelphia suburbs, the president was unusually critical of his own Federal Reserve Board for raising interest rates.
The strictly monetarist approach to the Fed's decision on the discount rate and other banking policies is ill-advised. I think the Federal Reserve Bank Board ought to look at other factors and balance them along with the supply of money. Now, in my judgment, too much of their decision is made just by measuring the amount of money available in our system.
Earlier today, the president flew to Ohio, a state his own strategists admit he's running behind in. At a town meeting in Dayton, Mr. Carter brought up Reagan's suggestion this week that the SALT II treaty should be dropped and that the U.S. should build up its nuclear defenses.
This kind of talk or proposal directly violates the commitments that our nation has made in the past to our allies. And I don't believe the American people want to see a nuclear arms race begun by this country that might aggravate an already dangerous situation.
Mr. Carter did not say, as he has before, that this election will determine whether there's war or peace. His own aides have called that an overstatement. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Philadelphia.
President Carter was asked today to comment on the fact that since the year 1840, every president elected in a year ending in 0 has died in office. Mr. Carter said, "I have seen those predictions. I am willing to take the chance." The president called the presidency the ultimate achievement, and he said it would be worth it even if I knew it would end in tragedy. 4 years ago, Jimmy Carter carried the state of Kentucky by a sizable margin, but this year, in places like Graves County, a traditional Democratic stronghold, there's some doubt about his chances. Roger O'Neill reports.
96% of the 16,584 voters in Graves County, Kentucky are Democrats. Few Republicans even bother running for office in this small agricultural and industrial area in the western part of the state. But this year, the political climate is different. There was a bad drought. Farmers say the corn was baked, the soybeans were stunted, and the tobacco got sunburned. President Carter isn't being blamed for the drought, but some farmers say many of his farm policies are worse than the drought.
Between the politics and dry weather, it's just about got us. I think politics is what's hurt us worse. We can live through the drought.
The tobacco crop is about half what it should be. Cornfields are producing only 10 to 20 bushels an acre. Last year, farmers got up to 140 bushels an acre. Factory workers aren't doing much better. This big tire plant has laid off about half its workers. The local men's clothing factory announced it was closing. 800 jobs are at stake. On the town square, politics is always a subject of conversation. But this year, the men are talking about the Republican candidate.
I don't know much about Reagan, but I know too much about Carter.
I'm a Democrat. I always have been, but I'm going to vote Republican. I'm going to make a change this time.
You're going to make a change this time? Why?
Well, it couldn't be any worse.
One of the old-time politicians said the people always thought their county was recession-proof and Republican-proof.
This county has been Democratic for so long that the presidential candidates have never bothered to campaign here. But this year, Graves County is up for grabs. Roger O'Neill, NBC News, Mayfield, Kentucky.
Independence candidate John Anderson had a problem solved for him today by the Federal Election Commission. The commission had ruled previously that if Anderson gets more than 5% of the vote in November, he will be eligible for federal campaign funds. Anderson wants to borrow millions of dollars and repay those loans with the federal funds. And today, by a vote of 5-1, the commission ruled that nothing in the law would prohibit banks from loaning the money. A careful and cautious decision, but a victory for the Carter-Mondale campaign has been asking for free equal time on television to respond to the many commercials for Ronald Reagan, which have been bought by independent groups supporting Reagan, not by the Reagan campaign itself. Today, the Federal Communications Commission ruled that the Carter-Mondale campaign is not entitled to equal time. Reagan has also been getting some help from religious programs on television. Religious broadcasters held a meeting in Virginia today, and Reagan was there. Ken Bodie has the story.
The man most involved in leading this Christian army to politics is Jerry Falwell, who keynoted the convention of religious broadcasters.
Good Christians make good citizens, and it's a sin not to vote.
Meeting at the same time is a summit conference of the moral majority, the political arm of Falwell's operation. 35 states represented here. Also on hand, Robert Billings, the religious liaison for Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign.
There is no question in my mind but that the candidate the Christian community gets behind will be the next president of the United States.
Some polls show President Carter ahead among evangelicals and way ahead among black evangelicals. But a Los Angeles Times poll indicates potential for Reagan. Among white evangelicals who watch the TV preachers or send them money, Reagan gets 50%, Carter 29%, and Anderson 12%. That's the Reagan target. And Billings brought along some Reagan TV commercials designed to play close to the religious broadcasts.
Work and family are at the center of our lives, the foundation of our dignity as a free people.
This week, Pat Robertson, one of the most famous TV evangelists, pulled out of the political movement. He said politics was becoming too dominant. Today, Reagan himself met with the broadcasters, against the advice of some staff members who think that too close an association with the evangelicals may cause a political backlash.
And our work is linked to yours in a very fundamental way.
It's difficult to evaluate the influence of television evangelists on politics. They've not been this heavily involved before, and some of the biggest names, like Billy Graham, Oral Roberts, and now Pat Robertson, are not involved this time. Still, some Reagan strategists see lots of Reagan votes in this movement, and that's why the candidate himself is here today, to show the flag. Ken Bodie, NBC News, Lynchburg, Virginia.
Among Reagan's big target states this year are Texas, Florida, and the big industrial states from Illinois to New York. One of those, a key state, is Pennsylvania, and Tom Pettit has a report on what's happening there.
Pennsylvania, battleground of strategies to win 27 electoral votes, and Reagan has been leading. With his blue-collar strategy and Carter's white-collar strategy, each guy is aiming at the other guy's own guys. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania usually votes Democratic for president. It has high unemployment, and in the primary it went for Kennedy. Big crowd. This week, same place, same size crowd for Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Carter doesn't represent the same values as such great Democrats as John F. Kennedy or Harry Truman.
Reagan goes for workers, unemployed or otherwise hurt by the economy, disaffected, Catholic, Eastern European, conservative or Kennedyite. It's working.
I'm a registered Democrat, and I plan on voting for Ronald Reagan.
Reagan Chairman Jim Phillips.
Right now we're smoking red hot here in Wilkes-Barre.
Mayor Tom McLaughlin, Democrat.
The estate is very, very important to Mr. Carter, and he's got to come here to impress upon the people that he's very concerned about our needs.
But Carter was out looking for white-collar votes in a Republican suburb of Philadelphia, grabbing for Eastern establishment Republicans who never did like Reagan much. This is Carter's massive retaliation against Reagan's blue-collar offensive, sending in an old aircraft carrier to make jobs at the local naval shipyard.
The real worth.
Carter's only worry about Anderson is that he might get some Kennedy votes. Might. This city went big for Kennedy in April. Will it go big for Carter in November? His Honor Billy Green, a Kennedyite, now with Carter, said,
"There is no question in my mind that Kennedy Democrats are going to vote for Jimmy Carter."
Reagan's managers think Mayor Green is wrong, unless Teddy should campaign with Carter every day. They suggest only Kennedy could jeopardize Reagan's blue-collar strategy. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Philadelphia.
Independent presidential candidate John Anderson was endorsed by the Miami News today. The newspaper described Ronald Reagan as an extreme conservative with limited vision and knowledge, Jimmy Carter as a vacillating moderate of modest ability, and Anderson, said the Miami News, is a fiscal conservative and a social liberal who does not dodge the issues.
Ronald Reagan would be ahead of President Carter, impressively ahead if the election were held today. And Reagan has made impressive gains since last week. That's the result of an NBC News election unit survey and assessment of the presidential campaign state by state. With 270 electoral votes needed for election, this is the way the figures add up. For Reagan, a total of 233 electoral votes either in his column or leaning toward him. For President Carter, a total of 143 electoral votes. The toss-up states account for 162 electoral votes. Since last week's survey, Ronald Reagan has gained 42 electoral votes. Mr. Carter has gained only 9. One big headache for the Carter campaign is the economy. This past week, one major bank boosted its prime interest rate to 14%. Other banks will likely follow. The White House strategy is to share some of the blame with Federal Reserve Chief Paul Volcker. John Palmer reports on the president's economy problems.
As the president returned from a leisurely weekend at Camp David for the final month of the campaign, Carter aides expressed worry about how the economy will affect his prospects for re-election. The president expressed his own concern while campaigning in a Philadelphia suburb last week when he attacked the Federal Reserve Board for hiking its discount rate, which in turn helped drive up interest rates. Mr. Carter made the attack even though he appointed the board's chairman and the majority of its members.
My own judgment is that the strictly monetarist approach to the Fed's decision on the discount rate and other banking policies is ill-advised.
Later, in a television interview, Mr. Carter conceded that the interest rate, now as high as 14% in some areas, is hurting him politically.
And it's something that I deplore very seriously. It would be obviously much better for me as a candidate for election if the interest rates were going down.
Mr. Carter has gone out of his way to point out that under the law he has no influence over the decisions made by the Federal Reserve Board. Nevertheless, Mr. Carter's aides are worried that the president will get the blame. One Reserve Board member felt the president's criticism was caused more by his concern about politics than the economy. The White House denies this. For Mr. Carter, the stakes are high. The Reserve Board's action could deprive him of the chance to point to economic recovery just before Election Day. John Palmer, NBC News, at the White House.
Delegates to the NOW convention today voted to denounce Ronald Reagan. The National Organization for Women called Reagan's stand on feminist issues medieval. But the 1,500 delegates did not throw their backing to Reagan's rival. The closest they came was to endorse not Jimmy Carter, but his platform.
President Carter was in Illinois and Wisconsin today, where he accused Ronald Reagan of quicksilver economics in terms of Reagan's plan for a 30% tax cut over 3 years and Reagan's belief that the budget can be balanced while taxes are being cut. John Palmer was with Mr. Carter.
The president took his campaign to the working-class suburb of West Allis near Milwaukee today, charging that the Reagan economic program cannot work because it offers something for nothing. After a brief tour of a trade school where he visited an auto repair class, the president attacked Reagan's proposals to turn welfare and education programs over to state and local control and said Reagan's proposal for a tax cut was ill-considered.
This Reagan-Kemp-Roth proposal is like quicksilver. It glitters. It promises quick results, easy answers, but it ends up being worthless, except for the very rich, who would benefit greatly at the expense of the working families of his country.
Mr. Carter spent most of the day campaigning in Illinois, a state he lost by a narrow margin 4 years ago, but one that he thinks he can win this time if he can heal the deep divisions within the Democratic Party in Chicago. Chicago Mayor Jane Byrne, who during the primary supported Kennedy but now backs Carter, was at the airport when the president arrived. Mr. Carter is walking a thin line between Mayor Byrne and her political rival, Richard Daley, son of the late mayor, who has been a consistent Carter supporter. Daley wasn't at the airport, but several of his supporters arrived in Chicago on the president's plane. Later, there was at least a public display of unity when Mr. Carter addressed a large rally attended by Democratic Party supporters of both the mayor and young Daley. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Chicago.
Ronald Reagan was in New Jersey, where he accused the Carter administration of jimmying the latest figures on wholesale prices, called producer prices, jimmying them to make them look better, Reagan said. Earlier this year, government experts began preparing for that change, which came out in the September report. Had it been prepared the old way, the price index would have gone up. Using the new method, it went down. Chris Wallace was with Reagan today.
Reagan tried to turn a problem into a campaign issue today, charging that a recent upturn in economic figures is the result of White House manipulation. Received warmly at a New Jersey shopping mall, Reagan said the producer price index went down last month because the administration calculated it a new way. The government acknowledged Friday that using the old method, prices would have gone up, but said politics had nothing to do with the change. Reagan still called it a cruel hoax.
Measured by the way this administration has used the imperial incumbency over the past year, I'm not surprised at the recent, forgive me for this, jimmying of official governmental statistics.
The attack showed Reagan's concern that improving economic figures late this month could tip the election to Mr. Carter. Reagan seemed to be preparing voters for a good consumer price index.
Let's watch out and make sure that they don't stick some phony figures in that one to make us think just on the eve of the election that things are going well.
At a fundraiser, Reagan said he will emphasize what he called the missing issues, accusing the president of trying to hide his record and sneak in to another term.
They portray it as something that makes you wonder where they've been for the last 3.5 years.
The phrase missing issues is a new way to express an old idea, that Mr. Carter's record is the best weapon Reagan has, and he must keep hitting it. Reagan say they'll package it different ways to keep it interesting, but the basic message won't change much. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Cherry Hill, New Jersey.
Our NBC News election unit has been watching the Carter-Reagan contest in the various states, and tonight we are going to take a look at how the presidential election stands now, with the voting 4 weeks away. Things could and probably will change, but here's what it looks like now. Reagan in blue is holding his base in the West, with Indiana and New Hampshire safely in his column. A number of other states are leaning to Reagan, in our judgment, including Texas. Carter's base in the South is not so secure, seen here in red, and these are the states that are leaning to Carter. And the states in white we record as toss-ups at the moment. The West is Reagan country, with Washington, Oregon, along with Texas, leaning toward Reagan. In the South, Carter can count on his home state, Georgia, and North Carolina, but the rest is uncertain. In the East, we see New York leaning to Carter, New Jersey leaning to Reagan, and Pennsylvania a toss-up. John Anderson has support in the East, but leads in no state. The big contest is in the Middle West. Ohio is leaning toward Reagan, but Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri are toss-ups. So by our reckoning, if the election were to be held today, which it isn't, and that's to be kept very much in mind, Reagan would carry 25 states with 233 electoral votes. Carter would win 14 states with 143 electoral votes, and 12 states would be too close to call. 270 electoral votes are required for election. Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Washington Post surveys show Reagan with more than 270 when solid and leaning Reagan states are tallied together. But it's 4 weeks to the election, and that's a long time in a presidential campaign. Man by his Republican challenger, Ronald Reagan. Reagan was responding to a statement made by Mr. Carter last night that the voters in this election will, in the president's words, determine whether this America will be unified, or if I lose, said Mr. Carter, whether Americans might be separated, black from white, Jew from Christian, North from South, rural from urban. Reagan responded to that today. Chris Wallace has the story.
Right here. Reagan aides were buoyant this morning, saying Mr. Carter had handed them an issue. The candidate reacted as he has to each Carter attack, more sad than angry.
I'm not asking any apology from him. I know who I have to account to for my actions. But I think he owes the country an apology.
Do you think Jimmy Carter fights dirty?
What?
Do you think Jimmy Carter fights dirty?
Well, I think he's a badly misinformed and prejudiced man. Certainly he's reaching a point of hysteria that's hard to understand.
A top Reagan advisor said the incident showed the sides of both candidates the Reagan camp wants voters to see. Mr. Carter is mean and unpresidential. Reagan is caring and mature. Campaigning around Philadelphia, Reagan kept to his role as the offended party, not once bringing up the attack. Both in the Republican suburbs and in a Polish area downtown, Reagan stayed with the Carter record. And the response in this neighborhood reflected Reagan polls, which show him running even with the president among white voters in this heavily Democratic city.
Now, the president says my tax cut would be inflationary, that I'm irresponsible. Well, I will admit to being irresponsible if he'll admit to being responsible.
The Reagan camp is mystified by the president's attacks. Some Reagan aides say Mr. Carter is behind and panicking. Others say he must be trying to get Reagan to react. Whatever the reason, Reagan aides say their men will stay above the attacks and hopes they keep coming. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Philadelphia.
And in fact, later Reagan did back off of his use of the word prejudiced, saying that maybe Mr. Carter is just prejudiced against him because he wants to be president. So another candidate has softened a tough statement about his opponent, and as Judy Woodruff reports, that has also happened in the Carter campaign.
A lot of people have said I've been running a mean campaign. Well,
There were a lot of laughs last night when the president opened his speech to Chicago Democrats with a reference to what his critics have been saying lately. But there was nothing funny about his charge a few minutes later that Reagan as president would polarize the country.
You'll determine whether or not this America will be unified, or if I lose the election, whether Americans might be separated, black from white, Jew from Christian, North from South.
It was the latest example of harsh rhetoric that some believe may be hurting Mr. Carter more than it does Reagan.
You've seen in this campaign the stirrings of hate and the rebirth of code words like states' rights in a speech in Mississippi.
That was the second week of the fall campaign at a black church in Atlanta. Carter aides denied the president was calling Reagan a racist, but 2 days later at a news conference, the president had to back down.
I am not blaming Governor Reagan. That's just exactly the point. The press seems to be obsessed with this issue. I am not blaming Governor Reagan.
But early the next week, Mr. Carter was back on the attack with an even harsher suggestion.
What you decide on that day, you and those who listen to your voice, will determine what kind of life you and your families will have, whether this nation will make progress or go backward, and whether we have peace or war.
Had he meant to suggest Reagan would start a war? No, Mr. Carter said. Once again today, the president found himself confronted with reporters' questions about whether his campaign rhetoric had gone too far, but he refused to talk about it. His aides deny that Mr. Carter's continuing harsh attacks on Reagan are part of any calculated strategy. They say what happened last night was simply Mr. Carter voicing unrehearsed what he really believes. But since public opinion polls have consistently shown that one of his strongest points is his image as a decent man, the question being asked is whether Mr. Carter himself is undercutting his strongest selling point. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, the White House.
One technique used with considerable success by the president is the town meeting, at which he often takes off his coat and answers questions from voters. It usually works well, but the story of one questioner at a recent town meeting has a different kind of ending. Roger O'Neill tells us about Clarence Murphy.
Clarence Murphy first got the attention of President Carter at this town meeting in Flint, Michigan last week. The Teamsters Union truck driver wanted to know why car haulers, people who deliver new cars and trucks from the factories to dealer showrooms, don't get the same special unemployment benefits called TRA that laid-off auto workers get.
We have quite a few drivers that they're losing their homes, and quite a few of us have lost our homes, and we're dependent on you.
I'd rather find out a little bit more, but I will call you when I get back to Washington, okay?
The president did call back the next night, but Murphy wasn't home.
Did he say he was going to do it? He wanted to talk to me personally.
On Sunday night, Mr. Carter called again.
He informed me that Congress had adjourned and that at the immediate future he couldn't do nothing about the TRA.
While Murphy has been called back to work, 9,000 other Teamster drivers, 1,000 in Flint alone, have not been. Murphy was invited to the White House to have his picture taken in the Oval Office. The Teamster went there today, a trip to Washington paid for by his union. But Murphy wanted more from the president than just a picture. Murphy says the president didn't want to talk about a bill in Congress that would extend TRA-type benefits to Teamster truck drivers.
He was in a hurry to sign a bill. What? Not the bill that I wanted him to sign.
Roger O'Neill, NBC News.
John Anderson has cleared the way to be on all 50 state ballots in the District of Columbia ballot in November. The last hurdle for Anderson, an independent candidate, was overcome yesterday when an appeals court ruled that he could be on the ballot in Jimmy Carter's home state of Georgia. Anderson said today, "You can't get me out of this race. I have just begun to fight." President Carter has decided to change his campaign tactics. The surveys show him behind Ronald Reagan. His descriptions of his Republican opponent have resulted in criticism that Carter has been running a mean campaign, and things have just not been working. So the president will now start running in a different way. Judy Woodruff has learned more about the change.
The president will no longer launch personal attacks on Ronald Reagan. That today from a top Carter campaign strategist who conceded the president had overdone the harsh criticisms. This advisor said the president's rhetoric had attracted so much attention that it had obscured the message he was trying to get across. That message is that there are big differences between Carter and Reagan on the issues. Differences the campaign will try to communicate in a more positive way from now on, starting with 15-minute paid political speeches on radio for the next 3 Sundays. Another Carter aide also conceded that recent criticisms of Reagan by the president and others in the campaign have not been focused enough and need to be narrowed to 2 or 3 themes the campaign can stick with. Sources in the campaign say by the 1st of next week, enough polling information will have come in to make decisions about writing off a large number of states, probably most of the West, including California. As one source put it, by that time the election will be only 3 weeks away, and we will have to fish or cut bait. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, the White House.
One problem for Mr. Carter is his own home territory, the South. As of now, we at NBC News show him to be safe in Georgia, North Carolina, and West Virginia. Arkansas, Alabama, and South Carolina are leaning to Carter by our reckoning. Virginia leads to Reagan, while our studies show Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and Kentucky are toss-ups. Ken Bodie has more on the southern states.
The South is the nearest thing Jimmy Carter has to a political base. 8 of his 10 best states in 1976 were Southern. But now it's nip and tuck throughout the region, close enough to force the president to come back home again and again. That's the Reagan Southern strategy. Force Carter to spend time and money defending his own base. Lee Atwater coordinates 4 Deep South states for Reagan.
Carter is probably the most blatantly political president we've ever had. He doesn't move unless it's politically expedient. He wouldn't have been down in the South if he didn't think he was going to lose these states.
It's not only the president. The Carter family and the Carter political family have been all over the South. Part of Carter's problem back home is that Ronald Reagan also has a base in the South. He won every Southern Republican primary and caucus. Another problem for Carter is indifference.
There's no interest. There's absolutely none. Absolutely. I've seen more interest in a constable race or councilman race than I have in the presidential race.
Faith Thomas is the Democratic sheriff of Davidson County, Tennessee. He runs one of the best nuts and bolts political operations in the South. He's for Carter, but he thinks the campaign took the South for granted too long.
A lot of people think they was already counted. You say we got the hay in the barn. We just move on. We just go up and work on northeastern states. But I think you'll have some problems in some of the southern states, and I think Tennessee's one of them.
The Carter camp is especially worried about apathy among black voters. Part of the Carter tactic to build turnout among blacks is to make them fearful of Reagan. And on the final day of registration in Georgia, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King, echoed that theme.
They know, when I say they, I mean the white community, Reagan speaks their language.
Tomorrow the president comes to Nashville to hold a town meeting at Opryland. Tennessee was one of his best states in 1976. It's not anymore, and that's why he's coming. Ken Bodie, NBC News, Nashville.
Ronald Reagan got some good news today. The executive board of the Teamsters Union has endorsed Reagan. That makes the Teamsters the first of the big unions to endorse the Republican candidate. Reagan visited a partially deserted steel plant in Ohio today, talking about air pollution, saying the problem now is substantially controlled. He had very hard words for the EPA. He also said he had a suspicion that the Mount St. Helens eruptions probably had put more pollution into the atmosphere than had been released by automobiles in the last 10 years. Reagan was trying to get some blue-collar support today, but he's about to get some competition for that vote. Today, another campaigner with a track record among labor voters began asking people to vote for President Carter. Tom Pettit reports.
Carter now needs Kennedy badly, but in New York today at a Carter-Mondale meeting, Kennedy recalled his own primary victory here, but his sales pitch fell flat.
I'm here today to ask you and all of New York to give that same support and confidence this fall for the re-election of Jimmy Carter as President of the United States.
No applause, none. Still, a Carter flack would send out audio excerpts of Kennedy to local radio stations. And he went to a makeshift studio in New York to record some commercials for the president, aimed at blacks and Hispanics, Carter trouble spots. They would not let us tape the taping, but Kennedy had insisted on his own writer and the producer of his choice, not the president's producer who ran the media campaign against Kennedy. From bitterness to need to near desperation for Kennedy magic. Carter gave Kennedy back his Secret Service detail. Carter's managers want more Kennedy than Kennedy has agreed to. Joint appearances are set for Boston, New York, Cleveland, Washington, and New Jersey. They also want him on the West Coast for 6 days. They offer help in cutting his campaign debts. Kennedy is campaigning for his friends, and at a union rally in Trenton, New Jersey last night, he was in fine form.
Everyone here is a president of something except me. Do our country a favor and send Jim Howard back to the Congress of the United States and re-elect Jimmy Carter as our next president of the United States. Thank you very much.
Jim Howard is the local congressman. Jimmy Carter is the candidate in trouble here. If Kennedy makes a miracle for Carter, that would not hurt him for 1984, nor would failure to make a miracle. Tom Pettit, NBC News, New York.
Good evening. A new model, Jimmy Carter, was on the road today. The tough rhetoric of recent days softened, making no personal attacks on his Republican challenger, Ronald Reagan. The president did accuse Reagan of making false charges that American military power is weak, saying statements like that cause our allies to lose confidence and give false hope to adversaries. John Palmer has more.
Mr. Carter's new, less combative, more presidential campaign style was much in evidence when he made his first stop this morning in mostly Republican East Tennessee. Instead of taking the negative approach, as he did earlier in the week, in suggesting that Reagan as president might split the country, today Mr. Carter accentuated the positive.
I want to see the nation united, North and South united, black and white united, rural and urban united.
During his airport speech, he never once referred to Reagan by name, only as my Republican opponent. Later at a town meeting at Nashville's Grand Ole Opry, Mr. Carter, asked about past mudslinging in the campaign, suggested that his remarks had been prompted in part because the press had not been tough enough on Reagan.
I have never intended to criticize Governor Reagan personally. Some issues affect me very deeply, and there have been occasions when the press has not covered the issue at all.
Mr. Carter also challenged Reagan's suggestion that the United States is staying neutral in the Iran-Iraq war because the United States is militarily weak.
We have clear naval superiority. We've got clear air superiority in that whole region.
Mr. Carter hopes his new, less strident rhetoric will give new emphasis to the issues that divide him from Governor Reagan. But most of all, he hopes that this change will get his campaign back on the track. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Nashville.
Ronald Reagan was also touring the South today and still insisting that he will not debate President Carter unless independent candidate John Anderson is allowed to participate. It's in Reagan's political interest to give Anderson publicity, since Anderson in several places is hurting Carter more than Reagan. A Tampa, Florida television station asked Reagan to debate Carter alone, and he said no today. Chris Wallace is with the Reagan campaign.
I am for clean air.
Reagan found himself mired today in a controversy over his views on the environment, and repeated efforts to end the problem only seemed to add to it. Tuesday, Reagan ridiculed environmental standards, then in a policy statement said the Clean Air Act should be rewritten because air pollution has, quote, been substantially controlled. Arriving in Alabama today, Reagan backtracked from that position.
I didn't say anything about it being substantially under control.
Reagan said he just wanted to give industry more leeway to meet environmental standards. But that contradicted Reagan's policy statement. At another stop, reporters pressed on.
The statement said it was substantially under control. Does that mean you don't read your statement?
Well, I think that the Clean Air Act has done a great deal for this country. Isn't it substantially under control? I think it is.
The environmental controversy took the edge off Reagan's second big union endorsement in 2 days, this time by the National Maritime Union, which endorsed Jimmy Carter in 1976. Reagan has moderated his views in pursuit of union votes. A campaign pamphlet denies Reagan would get rid of the Federal Worker Safety Agency, despite the fact that earlier this year he was critical of safety regulations. And it also denies Reagan would extend antitrust laws to unions, despite the fact that in April he said that was worth looking into. A top Reagan aide explained that in the primaries, Reagan was going after Republicans. Now he's going after Democrats. As for the candidate, he said there have not been any changes.
Well, I'm still where I was over these last 20 years.
One other development. Reagan revealed that he's had several conversations with former President Nixon recently about world affairs, including the Iraq-Iran war. The Reagan camp has avoided any links to Nixon. But today, Reagan said that he would consult Nixon as he would any former president. Reagan added that there would be no role for Nixon in a Reagan administration. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Birmingham, Alabama.
Robert Strauss, the president's campaign manager, said today, "I think there is a possibility that Ronald Reagan could win in the long run. But," said Strauss, "if we do the right things and if we get the issues structured, I think there's a strong probability that we will win." Ray Marshall, the Secretary of Labor, today accused Ronald Reagan of political opportunism. Marshall is just one of many administration officials who are involved in the campaign, one of the rewards of incumbency. Judy Woodruff has more on how that works.
There was a White House ceremony today to announce federal funding for new hydroelectric projects in 17 states, most of them states where the president is in a close race and where local publicity about federal generosity will do Mr. Carter no harm. Most presidents have used the incumbency to their best advantage, Nixon and Ford among them, but Mr. Carter could match his talents in that area against any of his predecessors. Examples are most obvious in the states the president badly needs to win. New York, Last week, Mr. Carter promised aid to New York City was coming soon.
The Treasury will issue your guarantees without delay.
2 days later in Niagara Falls, he signed bills that will mean tens of millions of dollars in environmental cleanup funds for upstate New York. Illinois, acres of federal land and $100 million federal dollars will be used to expand Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Next Monday, the president will tour a southern Illinois coal mine and announce the location of a synthetic fuels plant that will mean thousands of jobs for that economically depressed area. Florida, when the flood of Cuban refugees began to cause Mr. Carter political problems, he decided that several thousand would be shipped to Puerto Rico. Just being president commands media exposure, and the Carter campaign has taken full advantage of that fact. The first 8 minutes of a news conference carried by all three networks was used for an obviously political trumpeting of recent Carter achievements. All but one of the so-called town meetings Mr. Carter's held recently have been carried live on local television. And then there is the deployment of top government officials to generate favorable publicity for Mr. Carter. Aides boast that cabinet secretaries will be on the campaign trail a total of 110 days this month. Just looking at today's schedule shows top spokesmen in at least a dozen key states, including Defense Secretary Brown on an official trip to Texas where he praised the Carter record on defense. The president was criticized during the primaries last spring for exploiting the incumbency, but he won the nomination anyway. Now, despite further criticism, he continues to take full advantage of the office. He and his advisors apparently think doing anything else would be wasting a valuable opportunity. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, the White House.
Independent candidate John Anderson was in New York criticizing both Carter and Reagan. Anderson said Carter has peaked and that Reagan is making what he called an obvious and calculated effort to move toward the political center. Anderson said it's his view that the choice is now between himself and Reagan. President Carter has softened his personal attacks on Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan has been careful to give the impression that he's above that sort of thing, at least in recent weeks. But the television ads in this presidential campaign remain both tough and personal, and more people see the ads than see the candidates in person. Linda Ellerby has a report on this.
California isn't going to be going to war with.
So far, the harshest of the Carter commercials are those man-on-the-street interviews with people of California. The subject?
Ronald Reagan is not a man that I would want leading our country for any period of time.
I just can't imagine him being president. It's too complex a job.
I think he would have gotten us into a war right by this time. Carter certainly hasn't.
It wasn't until President Carter came that we...
Curiously, some people get to be man on the street in more than one anti-Reagan commercial on more than one subject.
He made a lot of statements about cutting back spending. He really never did. As a governor, it really didn't make that much difference because the state of California doesn't have a foreign policy. His problem as governor was the same as problem as he has now, namely that he always shot from the hip.
Shooting from the hip must be very popular in California, or else they just all speak alike.
I think he's the kind of guy who shoots from the hip.
He did shoot from the hip.
He shoots from the hip.
Lynn Nofziger, Reagan's communication director, commenting on the Carter commercial style.
Carter commercials have taken a direct personal attack on Governor Reagan, and I think ours have looked pretty much at his record as president.
For the last 3.5 years, every American has been staggered by the economic record of the Carter administration.
The graphs in the Reagan commercial show inflation is up, but Reagan's doing so well in the polls he can afford not to be too nasty, especially when there are independent committees to do commercials like the next one you're going to see.
In 1976, Jimmy Carter said, "Why not the best? Let's look at what he gave us."
What follows is meant to embarrass the president.
Burt Lance, and the list goes on. If you want a president whose judgment you can trust for a change.
Reagan's got 4 independent committees plus Anderson working for him.
Jerry Rafshoon, the president's advertising expert. The Carter campaign is bitter about John Anderson.
But we're running for president. Anderson's running for spoiler.
A theme echoed in Carter's radio ads.
If you're frightened about Reagan, then don't vote for Reagan. But you shouldn't vote for Anderson either.
Anderson's commercials start next week, and people in his campaign say those ads won't be mean and nasty because they think the Reagan and particularly the Carter ads have offended people. Linda Ellerby, NBC News.
And that's our report for this evening. I'm John Chancellor. Good night for NBC News. There was a lot of hot political rhetoric in Florida today as Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter crisscrossed the state, trading charges and accusations. President Carter said Reagan would not be a man to trust. Governor Reagan said Carter just plain broke his promise to keep inflation and unemployment down. The talk was often about Social Security, important to many residents of Florida. John Palmer was with Mr. Carter.
Today, just 2 days after Mr. Carter promised to moderate his campaign rhetoric, the president in a Florida television interview charged that Governor Reagan would not be a good man to trust with the affairs of the nation.
I think it would be a bad thing for our country if Governor Reagan should be elected. I don't know what he would do in the White House, but his opposition to the SALT II treaty, his opposition to Medicare, his opposition to many of the programs that are important, like the minimum wage or unemployment compensation, his call for the injection of American military forces into place after place after place around the world when diplomatic means ought to solve those problems indicate to me that he would not be a good president, a good man to trust with the affairs of this nation in the future.
Later, White House spokesman Jody Powell said the president was not attacking Governor Reagan's integrity and that it was not a personal attack. Mr. Carter is in trouble in Florida, a state he carried easily 4 years ago. Today, he went to the state legislature in Tallahassee to sign a refugee assistance bill, providing $100 million in federal money to pay for resettling Cuban refugees. Mr. Carter hopes today's visit and the signing of the Refugee Assistance Act will ease one of his most troublesome problems here in Florida, his handling of the Cuban refugee crisis. But Mr. Carter has other political worries here as well. The economy. In St. Petersburg, Mr. Carter defended his economic policy at a town meeting attended by elderly people, many of whom live on fixed incomes and are especially affected by inflation. He accused Governor Reagan of advocating that the Social Security system be made voluntary.
That means that anyone who wants to withdraw from Social Security can do so. As all of you know, that would cripple and destroy the Social Security system.
Mr. Carter promised to shield Social Security benefits by keeping them tied to the inflation rate. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in St. Petersburg.
Reagan's people strongly dispute some of the president's charges. They say Reagan does not oppose Medicare, that it is untrue to say that Reagan opposes unemployment compensation, and that Reagan has said repeatedly that he does not want to make Social Security a voluntary program. At one point, Reagan was making his accusations in Tampa, while Mr. Carter was making his in St. Petersburg. Chris Wallace was with Reagan.
The Reagan camp was well aware the president was just across Tampa Bay and worked hard to outdo him. Reagan rented a baseball field to issue a new proposal on Social Security, trying to reassure elderly voters he would do nothing to harm the system. Reagan called for repeal of the Social Security earnings limitation, which forces retirees to give up some benefits if they earn more than $5,000 in a year.
Americans who are collecting their Social Security benefits have earned those benefits. They've spent a lifetime working and paying taxes. Those benefits should be theirs.
Reagan aide said the extra benefits would cost $2 billion a year. The government said $2.6 billion. But the Reagan people said most of that would be made up by additional tax revenue when the elderly start earning more. Reagan wouldn't answer questions about that or anything else today.
You're late, fellas.
Yesterday, reporters stopped Reagan 10 times, asking him to explain contradictions in his environmental views. Aides clearly wanted no more of that. This afternoon, a big rally on the steps of the South Carolina State House. Reagan's call for a strong defense is popular in the South. He disputed Defense Secretary Brown's statement yesterday that the U.S. military has gotten stronger in the past 4 years.
You and I all know that is not true. This country today lacks in the defensive capability to meet its responsibilities.
Reagan's original goal in the South was to make Jimmy Carter fight for his base. And Reagan aides say the president's Florida trip today shows they've accomplished that. But now the Reagan camp talks about winning in the South. At this point, writing off only Georgia and North Carolina. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Columbia, South Carolina.
Is all this heated talk turning off the voters? Not as far as Tom Pettit has been able to find in the state of Wisconsin. He finds the voters there not terribly excited about the race, but at the same time paying a lot of attention to it.
Usually have a good voter turnout, you know.
Even in Wisconsin, home state of Anderson's running mate Pat Lucey, who campaigned here today, Even in Wisconsin, enthusiasm for candidates is running low, but interest in the election is surprisingly high.
This is NBC Nightly News.
And this is the battle on Channel 4 Milwaukee.
If I lose the election, whether Americans might be separated, black from white.
Informed and prejudiced man. Certainly he's reaching a point of hysteria that's...
From Tweedle Ron and Tweedle Jimmy.
Election officials in Milwaukee expect a near normal turnout, as they do at La Crosse on the Mississippi. Reagan was there the other night.
I don't like neither candidate. Do you?
Reagan claims to lead in Wisconsin, which has 11 electoral votes and a history of skepticism.
Maybe no one can be a good president.
West Dallas election officials expect a turnout like 1976, about 65% of the registered voters. That's typical for all Wisconsin, not just West Dallas, where the president visited this week. In Greenfield, Wisconsin, the campaign of 1980 is the subject of a special course at Whitnall High School.
You gotta pick between the better or the worst.
The more you read about Carter, the more you like him. And I tried to be biased in the beginning, and it's my mom's a Carter supporter, and my dad's a Reagan supporter, and I am. I started out with Reagan, and then I went to Carter, and I decided it's about time I had to make a choice.
One student had cut class to see Carter.
I was surprised at how much older he looks in person than he did in real life.
Some of the students indicated their parents also have more interest in the election than enthusiasm for a candidate. Our most recent national poll found similar feelings all over the country. So the question of the 1980 campaign is, will interest without enthusiasm translate into votes? And for whom? Tom Pettit, NBC News, Milwaukee.
Secretary of State Edmund Muskie, speaking at Notre Dame University today, attacked the advocates of military superiority and those who would abandon the SALT-II treaty. That attack apparently was aimed at Ronald Reagan, now running slightly ahead of President Carter in Indiana. We have details from Bernard Kalb at the State Department.
The Secretary of State never mentioned Ronald Reagan by name, but Muskie's target was obvious, with a former Democratic senator from Maine virtually implying that a Reagan victory over President Carter might involve the U.S. in armed conflict.
The air is now filled with after-the-fact prescriptions of belligerence. We are told that greater American military might could have prevented the course of events in Iraq or in Nicaragua. If we tried to order the affairs of other nations by force, we would be endlessly at war all over the globe.
Muskie seems acutely sensitive to any portrayal of him as a Carter campaign worker on the road trying to whip up votes for the president. But Muskie has made the argument here at the State Department that Americans are now talking about foreign policy issues, and therefore the Secretary of State should not be muzzled. Partisan or not, though, Muskie has an unusually busy schedule of speech-making during these final weeks before the presidential election, with appearances set during the next few days in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Buffalo, New York, and Washington, D.C. Bernard Kalb, NBC News, the State Department.
Ronald Reagan does not plan to respond to Muskie's remarks. That from a Reagan campaign spokesperson who added that while Reagan won't talk about it, surrogates for the candidate will. And we see that in this report from Rebecca Sobel.
Republican vice presidential candidate George Bush, campaigning in Rochester, had an immediate response to the speech. He called the secretary's comments appalling.
That seems to me to be a return to the low road. It seems to me to be a impossible role, really, in terms of how foreign affairs should be run for a Secretary of State.
Muskie's speech came only 2 days after Defense Secretary Harold Brown was sent to Texas to defend the Pentagon.
The United States today is strong militarily. We are ready, and our capability has grown during the past 4 years.
This morning, the Reagan camp brought out its own military advisors to say Brown is wrong. Reagan Foreign Affairs Advisor Richard Allen.
We think this is a dangerous attempt to delude Americans into thinking we can preserve world peace, when in reality we may not be able to preserve that peace.
Former Secretary of the Navy William Middendorf.
4 more years of this, of Jimmy Carter's leadership, at least as far as the Navy is concerned, to my mind, would be 4 more years of surrender on the installment plan.
Retired General Richard Stilwell.
Today, as compared to 5 years ago, we are weaker than the Soviet Union.
One Reagan campaign aide said as long as the president is sending his surrogates into the political battle, Mr. Reagan will do the same. Rebecca Sobel, NBC News, Washington.
And today's charges came after a week of barbed trading by the presidential candidates themselves. We'll have more on the campaign when we return. On the campaign trail, it was a week of charges and some counter-charges. Independent candidate John Anderson charged too many people were too interested in why he just didn't get out of the race. Ronald Reagan charged President Carter with being misinformed. And today, President Carter charged Reagan with making a preposterous collection of economic proposals. We have 3 reports.
2 of Mr. Carter's top political aides, Press Secretary Jody Powell and Domestic Advisor Stuart Eisenstadt, lashed out at Governor Reagan's economic policies today, saying he promises massive tax cuts to some groups while promising others big increases in spending.
And when you put all that together and add it up, it becomes a preposterous collection of proposals, ideas, suggestions, cut, add, and it is an economic mishmash, which is clearly inflationary.
Powell admitted that Mr. Carter continues to trail Governor Reagan both in electoral votes and in the popular vote, but he said the gap was narrowed somewhat this past week. On Thursday at an airport rally in East Tennessee, Mr. Carter displayed a more moderate campaign style, using less strident rhetoric to attack Reagan. This in response to suggestions from his political advisors that personal attacks on Reagan were backfiring. So instead of charging that Reagan as president would divide the country, as Mr. Carter had done earlier, he took a more positive approach.
I want to see the nation united, North and South united, black and white united, rural and urban united.
Mr. Carter may have toned down his rhetoric, but the thrust of his technique remains the same, hard-hitting attacks on what life would be like with Reagan in the White House. During a campaign stop in Florida yesterday, the president told a group of senior citizens Reagan's policies would lead to the destruction of the Social Security system. He ended his campaigning for the week saying Reagan would not be a good man to trust with the affairs of the nation.
Tomorrow, the president will try out a new campaign technique reminiscent of former President Roosevelt's fireside chats. He'll speak about the economy and a nationwide radio broadcast, the first of 3 such paid political broadcasts live from the Oval Office. And for most of the coming week, Mr. Carter will concentrate on the economy, an area where he is vulnerable, but where he feels Governor Reagan may be even more vulnerable. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign at the White House.
Ronald Reagan was bogged down in a murky issue much of the week. When he flew home to a rally in the San Fernando Valley last night, the smog was so thick his plane was diverted to another airport. Earlier, he tried to explain his position on pollution laws, beginning in Ohio, where he told steelworkers threatened with layoffs that the Environmental Protection Agency is hurting their industry with too many regulations. Reagan claimed an eminent scientist has shown that nature is a bigger polluter than man.
According to his research, if we totally eliminated all the man-made sulfur dioxide in the air today, we would still have 2/3 as much as we have, because that's how much nature is releasing.
In Alabama, he went further, saying air pollution is substantially under control.
Well, I think that the Clean Air Act has done a great deal for this country. Isn't it substantially under control? I think it is. Yes.
But when he arrived in smoggy Los Angeles, Reagan backed off, saying he never intended to lessen air pollution requirements, even for the steel industry. He called the questions nitpicking, but they were offset by endorsements from the Teamsters and the Maritime Union, and a feeling on his staff the campaign is going their way. At a series of well-staged rallies in the South and Midwest, he continued to insist the economy is the issue. And when President Carter again attacked him as a man who would divide the country, Reagan called him badly misinformed and prejudiced.
Is this the level of campaigning you expect for the next 4 weeks in the White House?
Well, that's going to be up to him, but certainly he's reaching a point of hysteria that's hard to understand.
Reagan aides are actually delighted with the president's continuing harsh attacks. They think it wrecks the gentle image he won with in 1976. Heidi Schulman, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign.
John Anderson now has a campaign song, and there's a line in the lyrics that answers the question many people were asking this week. Why is he staying in the race?
We will see the light on election day.
Anderson says he's convinced voters will see the light, his light, late in the campaign, perhaps as late as Election Day itself, when they realize Reagan might win.
As people see Carter fade, they are going to realize that all the time there has been here another candidate, the third man, the real alternative, John Anderson.
This week, Anderson was trying to win it by ridiculing the president in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Ohio, the states where he can do the most damage to Mr. Carter.
And he's now going to be something quite different. He's going to address the issue. Well, he's going to have to be as much of an actor as Ronald Reagan was for about 30 years before he got into politics.
Anderson is relaxed and in high spirits these days. He enjoys an occasional gag with reporters and appears more comfortable with the obligatory photo opportunities of a campaign. For now, he's ignoring the polls that show him slipping toward a single digit.
I never said that I was going to pick a certain percentage figure and get out of the race.
Anderson cannot afford to get out. He's already borrowed $700,000 from his supporters, promising to repay them from federal funds he expects to get after the election. The loan money will be used to buy time for 2 television commercials that describe who Anderson is and what he stands for, and a 30-minute program scheduled for broadcast the last weekend of the campaign to capitalize on what Anderson predicts will be a fourth-quarter surge for him. Jim Cummins, NBC News, with the Anderson campaign in Washington.
Good evening. The latest NBC News Associated Press national poll is out, and it shows Ronald Reagan still ahead of Jimmy Carter. The poll shows Reagan holding his base of Republican support, while Carter's Democratic support is building. We polled more than 1,500 likely voters last week by phone around the country, and they favor Reagan over Carter. Not much change from our last poll. Anderson has lost support in this group. This is a more precise way of looking at things. 2/3 of our sample has now decided how it will vote next month. Reagan leads the president in this group by about as much as he did before. The only change is a slight decline for Anderson. There were charges last week that President Carter was running a mean campaign. 40% of our sample agrees with that, but 55% don't think Mr. Carter has been mean about Ronald Reagan. And Democrats in our sample are coming home to Carter. Before this summer's Democratic convention, only 42% of the Democrats favored Carter. Last week, 60% favored the president. Important because Democrats outnumber Republicans. Carter was in New York City today, honoring Italians on Columbus Day, but worrying about another group, Jewish voters. Judy Woodruff reports.
The president tried to reassure a Jewish audience of his commitment to Israel, but he was interrupted repeatedly by hecklers who accused him of selling Israel out.
The president will never turn his back on Israel. I never have, and I never will. We believe in an undivided Jerusalem. We believe in a Jerusalem with free access for all faiths to the holy places. We believe that the future of Jerusalem can only be decided through negotiations with the concurrence and with the agreement of Israel.
Mr. Carter offered his Jewish audience virtually everything they wanted to hear, including a promise the U.S. would never deal with a Palestine Liberation Organization as long as it refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist. Press Secretary Jody Powell later told reporters the president was irritated by the heckling, but his political advisors are not unhappy about it. In fact, they believe this kind of confrontation helps the president because it makes him appear capable of taking on his critics. Mr. Carter went from a Jewish audience to a Catholic one. He joined New York Democrats heading up a Columbus Day parade and hoped to win over Italian-American voters, who make up 20% of the electorate in New York and New Jersey. Next stop, a coal mine in southern Illinois, a section where the president ran well in 1976, but where high unemployment is hurting him this year. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, New York.
Our latest NBC News Associated Press poll shows Reagan leading Carter, but it also shows that the number of Republicans who support Reagan is not increasing. The percentage of Republicans supporting Reagan in our sample is no higher now than it was last summer at the time of the Republican convention. Reagan had hoped to appeal to blue-collar workers, who often vote Democratic. Our figures show blue-collar workers beginning to support Carter, not Reagan. Reagan himself was in California today, and Chris Wallace was there.
Reagan put on a Hollywood production today, barnstorming Southern California by helicopter and bus. Reagan leads the president by more than 10% here, aides say, and just wanted to show he's not ignoring California voters. Today, they certainly did not ignore him. First stop, Claremont College in the Republican suburbs, where Reagan found a campus scene out of his term as governor in the 60s. Smog is bad here, and most of the demonstrators protested Reagan's comments last week about easing air pollution standards.
It isn't true that I suggested that we should let up and not do anything about smog. As a matter of fact, I couldn't believe all of that distortion when it was our administration that put in the strongest air pollution control laws in the whole United States.
Some protesters shouted "Heil Reagan" and gave the Nazi salute.
If it wasn't for our generation, they'd be saying "Heil somebody" today.
The candidate had other problems. Reagan says he saved California from bankruptcy. But today, the man he replaced, former Governor Pat Brown, called a news conference to say he left Reagan a big surplus and to demand a retraction.
They are deliberate lies because he knows exactly what the situation was.
This afternoon, Reagan finally got a friendly reception at a retirement village, telling the crowd he will do nothing to hurt Social Security. Reagan won't be back in California until the day before the election, spending most of the next 3 weeks in the toss-up states that will decide this race. And after a day like this one, Reagan may prefer to be a little farther from home. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Seal Beach, California.
And the latest figures in the NBC AP poll show no sign of what John Anderson hopes for, a late surge of support for his independent candidacy. Among our total sample of likely voters, 86% tell us they think Anderson can't win. And among those who are Anderson supporters, almost half of them say they are likely to end up voting for someone else. Anderson was among those attending the festivities in New York City today. Here's Bob Jameson.
John Anderson had to stand around on a New York street corner for 10 minutes waiting for President Carter's entourage to pass before he was permitted to take his place in the Columbus Day parade. Just as he ignored that evaluation of his importance, Anderson is also ignoring his declining support in the polls.
When the only reason that people are voting for President Carter is because they don't want Ronald Reagan, or they're voting for Ronald Reagan because they don't want President Carter, those are poor reasons indeed. And I think there is time.
Anderson insists there will be a last-minute surge to him. He argues that 40% of the electorate can still be persuaded to vote for him.
If you've got 40% that you can still work on, there is every reason in the world to continue to work with every fiber of your being to win that election, and that is precisely what I intend to do.
Anderson's campaign is almost $1 million in debt, and he has been unable to get any bank loans. But Anderson is borrowing money from his supporters to finance a last-ditch effort for more support. Aides say first returns from their direct mail appeal indicate supporters will loan the campaign more than $2 million for television advertising. They believe those commercials to begin airing this week will give Anderson enough of a boost to at least make him a factor in several key states. But unlike Anderson, they see no last-minute surge for his candidacy. Bob Jameson, NBC News, with the Anderson campaign.
Time now for our weekly survey of where the Carter and Reagan campaigns stand with the election 3 weeks away. This is how it looks to us as of this moment. Looking at the whole country, here are the states we see as solid for Carter, and the states leaning toward Carter. These are the states we believe to be solid for Reagan, and here are states leaning to Reagan. The white states we tally as toss-ups, too close to call. We have moved 2 important states into the toss-up category, Texas and New Jersey, which were shown leaning to Reagan last week. If the election were held today, and it won't be, we show Reagan getting 190 electoral votes, Carter 144, with 204 electoral votes in the undecided states, seen here in white. It takes 270 to win. Reagan is holding his base of support in the West. Last week we showed Washington State leaning to Reagan. Now we see it as solid Reagan. Carter's southern base is not the solid South. Several toss-up states there. In the East, we have changed the status of New Jersey, last week leaning toward Reagan, this week too close to call. We show Maine now leaning to Carter, having been a toss-up last week, and we have shifted Delaware from leaning Democratic to toss-up. The critical states are in the Midwest, the big industrial states with lots of electoral votes, and several of the big ones are still too close to call. So that's how we see it as of now. Reagan ahead, Carter behind, Anderson leading in no state, and the key to it all in the toss-up states, such as Texas. The Reagan campaign has, just this week, given Texas a higher priority, and Ken Bodie is there.
President Carter has some things going for him in Texas. One is that the Texas economy is in better shape than the country's. Another is that John Anderson isn't much of a factor here.
We're calling to find out if you or anyone else in your household is supporting John Anderson.
The Anderson campaign is on short rations, running phone banks at night from an empty real estate office.
Grassroots politics in the middle of Texas.
Also, the Democratic campaign is well organized, underway, and confident.
They're Democrat 3-4 to 1, and when you've got that kind of an advantage, particularly in the Mexican American and black community, and if you can get people to the polls, then as a Democrat you can't lose here.
If they turn out, that's the problem. Many Texans seem to have other things on their minds. Another possible problem, some Democrats here are conservative.
Although I'm a Democrat, but I believe in the conservative cause.
Republican Governor William Clements is making it his personal business to rid the country of Jimmy Carter.
I can assure you that in 1980 presidential election, my commitment and my dedication is to see that Mr. Carter goes back to Georgia.
50 Reagan phone banks already operating. The Republicans expect to make 3 million calls by Election Day. With commercials like these, Reagan is going after the Mexican-American vote, which was 87% for Carter in 1976.
Nuestra oportunidad. Reagan reconoce nuestra época.
Running mate George Bush is showing strength with moderate Republicans and independents, especially in the suburbs. Little fact of history. No Democrat has been elected president this century without carrying Texas, and is just that important this year to Jimmy Carter. Ken Bodie, NBC News, Dallas.
Ronald Reagan today promised to appoint a woman to the U.S. Supreme Court if he's elected president. Reagan said he made the promise to set the record straight on his attitude toward equal opportunities for women. More from Chris Wallace with the Reagan campaign.
His own polls continuing to show he runs better among men than women. Reagan took a dramatic step today to reach out for female support.
Now, I'm announcing today that one of the first Supreme Court vacancies in my administration will be filled by the most qualified woman I can possibly find. One who meets the high standards I will demand for all court appointments. It's time for a woman to sit among our highest jurists.
Reagan acknowledged that his opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment has hurt him with some women, but said today's announcement shows his commitment to equal opportunity. Reagan added that in making appointments, he won't be bound by the Republican Party platform, widely interpreted as requiring that new judges be anti-abortion.
You make those appointments on the whole, not only qualification, but the whole philosophical viewpoint of the individual, not picking out individual or single issues.
On another issue, Reagan was asked about reports the League of Women Voters is reevaluating whether John Anderson is still a serious candidate and should be included in debates. While not committing himself, Reagan implied he wants Anderson included as long as he's in the race, regardless of what the League decides.
It could just be that they might get so anxious to have another debate that they'll kind of shade the rule of fairness themselves. I hope not.
This afternoon, Reagan flew to Idaho, where he attacked the president for being insensitive to Western concerns. One reason he expects to sweep this part of the country. Today's Supreme Court announcement was a bold step for a campaign that has often been criticized for sitting on its lead. But Reagan aides worry that as the election nears, Democrats will come home to Mr. Carter. They hope that today they gave voters a new reason to go with Reagan. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Idaho Falls, Idaho.
John Chancellor interviewed President Carter at the White House today and asked about that Reagan promise to name a woman to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Mr. President, Ronald Reagan says if elected, he's going to name a woman to the Supreme Court. What's your response to that?
That's his privilege to make that promise. I understand that when he was governor of California, he made 600 appointments to judges, and only 12 of them were women. And he made 3 appointments to the Supreme Court of California, and they were all white males. But I think it is a mistake for a president to promise that in the Supreme Court appointment that it would be a particular kind of American. I'll consider all of them, and I'll continue to treat women fairly.
Mr. President, my sense of the campaign to date is that there's been a great deal of talk about competence and character, that your opponent is questioning your competence and that you've been questioning his character. How would you describe the campaign so far?
I think it's provided an inadequate means by which the approach on the issues between myself and Governor Reagan could be addressed. We've accepted 5 or 6 different invitations, for instance, for a man-to-man debate between the nominee of the Democratic Party and the nominee of the Republican Party. Governor Reagan has refused in every instance to carry on such a debate. I challenge him now in a very constructive way, not an adversarial way, to meet me under any circumstances on a head-to-head debate so that he and I can be cross-examined on how differently we see the major issues that affect the American people now and in the future.
In the NBC poll among decided voters, you're about 10 points behind. We do see evidence in that poll that it's going to come closer to that. Can you tell me how you think it's going to go for the rest of the campaign and how it will come out?
I think I'll win. We have 3 weeks to go. So far, the campaign has been distorted to some degree by the inevitable debate about the debates, the conjecture about who is ahead or who's not ahead, and the charges and counter-charges between candidates. I think in the future, though, the difference on the issues will be much more significant among the voters, and because of that, I think I'll win.
Do you know who they are? Vice presidential candidates Walter Mondale and George Bush, of course. They've both been busy on the campaign trail this fall, but they haven't been getting much attention from the national press. Still, each man, Mondale for the Democrats and Bush for the Republicans, has a specific assignment these days. Reports on those assignments from George Lewis and Bob Kerr.
Walter Mondale is Jimmy Carter's emissary to voters who want a liberal on the Democratic ticket but don't believe the president is one. Although some have found Mondale's liberalism suspect, he has had some success getting Kennedy Democrats marching with Carter again and winning back labor leaders who feel closer to Mondale than to the president.
We have many, many things that divide us. But for crying out loud, let's stay together and support the broad principles of social and human justice that we've built over this many years through the auto workers, the Democratic Party, the AFL-CIO, and all of us that have worked together.
Mondale believes he's been given more responsibility in office than any other vice president, and that this has helped strengthen the ticket. It's not uncommon to see a gymnasium decorated with signs welcoming Mondale with no mention anywhere of Jimmy Carter.
He is a good man.
He calls his boss a good president who will get better. They have disagreed on some issues and campaign tactics, but Mondale is genuinely enthusiastic in his support and defense of the president. For example, at the White House today, Mondale reacted to Ronald Reagan's charge that Carter failed to condemn attacks on French Jews.
This charge is not only inaccurate and wrong, I believe it is disgraceful, and I believe that Mr. Reagan should apologize and apologize today.
In 1976, as running mate, Walter Mondale was credited with bringing votes to Jimmy Carter. And when this year's race is over, no one will be able to accuse Mondale of not doing enough to help. Bob Kerr, NBC News, with the Mondale campaign in Washington.
George Bush had been expected to play a prominent role in the campaign because of his experience in foreign affairs and national security. Also because of Reagan's age, because of the possibility Bush might someday inherit the White House. Then came the Bush trip to China, which went badly after Reagan called for close relations with Taiwan. There were other campaign blunders. Both Reagan and Bush found themselves having to do a lot of explaining. Bush then adopted a very cautious campaign stance.
I'm not going to be trying to make news anymore. What I want to do.
For Bush, that meant adhering faithfully to the Reagan message, not breaking any new ground, not interjecting his own opinions.
I'm not saying that if I had a strong conviction I would be free to cite it, but I don't want to mess up things. I don't want to go out there and foul things up.
While he sticks to his campaign of cautiousness, Bush may be given a more prominent role in the closing weeks. In places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Texas, Bush is highly appealing to many voters who have misgivings about Reagan. Beginning this week, Bush is featured in television ads which are being broadcast in certain key states.
Inflation's up, unemployment's up, mortgage and interest rates up, and the American people, well, they're fed up.
Early Reagan ads did not even mention Bush's name. Now, as the Republicans try to moderate their image, Bush's presence on the ticket is very evident. Bush hopes Reagan will give him an active role as vice president. If not, he jokes, he'll be attending a lot of funerals in Ecuador. George Lewis, NBC News, with the Bush campaign.
With John Chancellor in New York.
Good evening. It began to look today as though Ronald Reagan may be thinking about dropping one of his key campaign positions, his insistence that any debate with President Carter also include independent candidate John Anderson. The president, as we heard on this program last night, is insisting on a two-man debate without Anderson. Mr. Carter doesn't want to give Anderson any extra publicity. And now, with the polls indicating a close Carter-Reagan race, Reagan may give Carter what Carter wants. More from Chris Wallace.
We are late, yes.
As Reagan campaigned in Ohio today, aides reassessed whether he should debate the president one-on-one. The Reagan camp expects the League of Women Voters to call for a Carter-Reagan debate this week, excluding John Anderson as no longer a serious candidate. In the past, Reagan has said Anderson must be included. Today, he ducked the question.
This is a decision. We're waiting to see all the facts now, what comes in, what is the decision about Anderson being a viable candidate.
For all Reagan's caution, one of his top advisors says the chances are 50-50 there will be a Carter-Reagan debate. 3 weeks ago, that same aide said there was almost no chance. But he now says that Reagan may need a debate because the race is tightening up. The advisor said that Reagan must decide which hurts more, the fallout from not debating or the fallout from eliminating John Anderson, and thereby lessening Anderson's drain on Democratic votes. Today in Lima, Ohio, Reagan was going after Republican votes, trying to energize the faithful, as one aide said. This area is Midwest Republican, and Reagan offered none of his new moderate positions here. He called for more defense and less government, and he charged that having imposed Social Security and windfall profits taxes in his first term, the president would raise taxes even higher in a second term.
In 3.5 years, he has doubled taxes on the American people. Isn't that enough? We now know what he plans to do with 4 more years. Catch your breath, hold on to your hats, and grab your wallets, because Jimmy Carter's analysis of the economy means that his answer is going to be higher taxes.
Reagan aides say he will need every Republican he can get, as more and more Democrats support the president. The Reagan camp now rates all the big states, from New Jersey to Illinois, as toss-ups. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Lima, Ohio.
The White House said later that Reagan's assertion that taxes have doubled for every American is totally false and misleading, that individual taxes have not doubled or even come close to doubling. What is coming close is the Carter-Reagan contest, its closeness borne out by our own surveys and by the NBC News AP poll. The latest Gallup poll shows the race to be very close. Gallup puts Reagan at 45%, Carter at 42%, which means it's about even statistically, and Anderson is shown with a big loss, down to 8%, which is relatively good news for Jimmy Carter, who has improved his standing in the Gallup. He was in Massachusetts today hoping for help from Senator Edward Kennedy, and Judy Woodruff has that story.
Campaigning before an elderly audience in Boston, the president attacked Reagan's past statements on Medicare and Social Security. He singled out one of Reagan's recent comments on social reform under President Franklin Roosevelt.
He continues to say that the compassionate programs of the New Deal were actually based on fascism. Franklin D. Roosevelt wouldn't approve of a candidate who said that, quoting his own words,
Alongside the president in Boston was his former bitter opponent, Senator Kennedy, whose support Mr. Carter hopes will rub off on him. It was clear from looking at a crowd of high school students that some Kennedy supporters are not persuaded, but the senator played the role of the loyal Democrat anyway.
And are you going to go out and elect a Democratic ticket with President Carter right at the head of it?
The president flew next to northeastern Pennsylvania, coal country where he ran well in 1976, but where he's having problems this year. At a town meeting near Wilkes-Barre, Mr. Carter poked fun at Reagan's recent suggestions that pollution is made worse by trees and volcanoes.
I noticed that when we came in to the airport, the environment was clear, the air was fresh to breathe. I guess that the trees and the volcanoes took the day off.
Carter aides say they're delighted at reports that the League of Women Voters may decide to sponsor a two-man debate after all, because they believe it would cut down further the threat from John Anderson. But they warn that if any debate is not agreed on soon, it may be difficult to schedule in the last few days before the election. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
And John Anderson's independent campaign is, as we've seen this evening, in deep trouble. Our poll taken last week put him at 8%. The latest Gallup has him at 8%. All of this far below the 15% the League of Women Voters says he needs to be in any debate. Today, the Anderson campaign said it will rely for financing on loans from individual supporters. It has raised more than $1 million from them in 11 days. But it is giving up on trying for bank loans, since the banks won't cooperate. Bob Jameson has more on that.
These banks said...
Anderson's lawyer, Mitchell Rogovin, charged that pressure on bankers from the Carter campaign caused the loan scheme to fail. Rogovin cited a memo prepared by the Democratic National Committee and circulated in banking circles, warning that there might be legal problems with such loans.
There was concern expressed to us on a number of occasions by a number of bankers and their lawyers about the possibility of retaliation for having made such loans. So the net effect of this was that we had a chill over our capacity to use the banking system to extend credit to us.
Rogovin said the campaign will now rely on loans from private supporters that may total $3 million to finance a last-ditch television campaign. Anderson, campaigning in Milwaukee, charged the White House had intimidated bankers, but admitted there wasn't enough hard evidence to sue the Carter campaign. But he said the loan controversy fits into a campaign-long pattern of White House efforts to frustrate his candidacy.
I don't think you have to be any great scholar of political campaigns to know that when something like that is prepared and then obviously had to be leaked, that it has some connection with the other portions of the effort of the Carter-Mondale campaign committee, to have an effect on my campaign.
But at least one bank which turned Anderson down said its decision had nothing to do with political considerations or pressure. Bob Jameson, NBC.
Some prominent black Americans, and he got some today. The Reverend Ralph Abernathy, a close associate of the late Martin Luther King, came out for the Reagan-Bush ticket in Detroit today. So did the Reverend Hosea Williams, a well-known black leader. Chris Wallace has the story.
Reagan aides called it their October surprise. The Reverend Ralph Abernathy announcing that this November he'll vote Republican.
I endorse the candidacy of Ronald Reagan as the next president of the United States.
Reagan staffers had talked to Abernathy since August about an endorsement. They view it as an important step in their effort to broaden Reagan's appeal. Abernathy endorsed Jimmy Carter in 1976, but he said the president's economic policies have hurt black people.
We as the patient are getting sicker, and we need to change doctors.
Reagan also won the support of civil rights leader Hosea Williams. As with Abernathy, his endorsement was mostly an attack on President Carter.
Ain't no way in the world Governor Reagan could do no worse than Jimmy Carter.
Abernathy did not tell Reagan about the endorsement until after a private meeting this morning. The candidate seemed genuinely moved.
I just didn't realize that such a thing could happen. I'm overwhelmed.
This afternoon, another Reagan supporter, Donny Osmond, warmed up the crowd for a rally in suburban Detroit. This is an area of moderate Republicans, most of whom voted for George Bush in the Michigan primary. Today, Bush was here to help his running mate, and so was Michigan's favorite son, Gerald Ford, who reminded voters unemployment in this state is the highest in the nation.
I'm proud to stand here
in the state that I love and endorse for all of you Ronald Reagan, the next president of the United States.
So Reagan had a little help today from old and new friends, looking for any kind of edge in a close race. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Birmingham, Michigan.
Another nationally known black, Mayor Charles Evers of Fayette, Mississippi, told UPI today that Mississippians should not vote for President Carter because, in his view, the president has ignored Mississippi and has also used blacks in his campaign. Mr. Carter was campaigning in the Northeast today, and tonight he and Ronald Reagan will be at the same political dinner in Manhattan, the only time they will see each other in the campaign if there is no debate. Judy Woodruff was with the Carter campaign.
Campaigning in the New York suburbs, the president pursued a theme his campaign thinks is successful, painting a scare picture of a Reagan presidency. He pounded away at what he called Reagan's very disturbing habit of recommending the use of military force, and zeroed in on Reagan's suggestion that the U.S. might retaliate for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan by blockading Cuba.
This would immediately have created a major confrontation between ourselves and the Soviet Union, because every day the Soviet Union delivers to Cuba several millions of dollars worth of goods and services. This would have precipitated an international threat of war greater than any our nation has faced since we've got peace finally.
Mr. Carter also painted a frightening picture of what Reagan's suggestion of a U.S. nuclear arms buildup would mean by describing vividly how destructive nuclear weapons are. Earlier, campaigning in Connecticut, the theme was federal health care. The president visited a children's hospital and used it as a backdrop to criticize Reagan's positions. At one point, he tried to deny that his visit had any political motive, but he had to back down.
As president, I could have been anywhere in the nation this morning in this last few days of a crucial campaign. I wanted to come here not to get votes, although that may be part of it.
Tonight, the president will see Reagan face-to-face at the annual Al Smith Dinner, a Catholic function in New York City. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, New York.
John Anderson is low in the national polls, but in some northern states he is still very much a factor. In many places, he is taking potential votes away from Carter and in some places from Reagan. In Massachusetts, for instance, a Boston Globe poll last Sunday showed Carter with 33% support, Reagan with 32%, and Anderson with 21%. Ken Bodie has more on the Anderson factor.
Why is Jimmy Carter so worried about John Anderson? Why is he afraid to debate John Anderson?
John Anderson has begun to fade in the polls.
John Anderson needs your vote, time, and financial support.
He's had money problems, no television advertising, and the perception is growing that Anderson simply can't win. But this election is getting tighter and tighter, and in 14 states, with 222 electoral votes, Anderson is definitely a factor. In each of these states, the most recent state polls show Anderson between 10 and 25%, with Carter and Reagan separated by no more than a few points.
National Unity Campaign for John Anderson, can I help you?
In some of these places, Anderson headquarters are overflowing with volunteers, preparing lists for other volunteers to phone from their homes, always battling the perception that Anderson just can't win.
Who cares about the polls? When America stops voting for the guy that they believe in, America stops moving forward, you know what I mean?
That's Anderson's problem. His strength is largely based on dissatisfaction with the other two candidates.
I don't think he has the greatest chance of winning, but I'm just not satisfied with Carter, and I've never been a Reagan fan.
I've thought of voting for Anderson, but only because I find the other two candidates so repulsive.
But Anderson's support is soft because some people feel that as the election gets closer, people are reluctant to cast a protest vote.
I'm afraid of throwing away my vote to John Anderson.
It would be if I thought he would have a chance of winning. It'd be a throwaway vote.
In Connecticut, the polls show an even split, three ways. It's one place that Anderson's backers are actually optimistic about winning.
The latest poll showing that Connecticut citizens aren't concerned about the national standing. New Englanders are hardy souls, you know, they're gonna hang tough.
The Carter campaign is convinced that Anderson still hurts the president much more than he hurts Ronald Reagan. And that's one of the reasons they've enlisted Edward Kennedy to stump the Northeast and the Midwest. John Anderson is finding out just how difficult it is for an independent to run for president, but in the closing days of this campaign, the voters he still has in key electoral states are more than a margin of difference between Reagan and Carter. Ken Bodie, NBC News, Boston.
Tonight, another of our special interviews on campaign issues with Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. This one involves an issue on which the two men are in profound disagreement: the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. Here's what they said about it in separate interviews.
I happen to be opposed to the amendment, actually, in what I think is the best interest of women, because the amendment takes out of the hands of elected representatives this question of discrimination and puts it into the hands of unelected judges. The other fault with the amendment is it would also eliminate those discriminatory laws that favor women mainly because of the physical difference. Labor laws that prevent an employer from demanding that a woman employee do something that would be physically injurious to her. Now, I don't think we want to do away with those things. Now, what I proposed is that if I were president, I would appoint a liaison to be in contact with the states to encourage states to find where they have discriminatory laws and eliminate them.
That's a silly proposal. The Republican platform for 40 years has favored the Equal Rights Amendment. All of Reagan's predecessors, who were Democrats or Republicans in this office, have favored the Equal Rights Amendment. All the Equal Rights Amendment says is that no state government and no federal government can pass any law that discriminates against a person because of sex. That's all it says. It says that you cannot discriminate. And his opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment is very hard for us to understand. The alternative proposals that he puts forward, I think, are really without any real substance, and also are designed to try to recapture some of the lost support that has come to him because of from people who disapprove of his unprecedented abandonment of the long-time Republican Party commitment to the Equal Rights Amendment.
Tomorrow night's interviews with Carter and Reagan will deal with another issue in the 1980 campaign: the role of the clergy in politics. Ronald Reagan brings not only his experience as governor of California to this campaign, he also has his years of experience as an actor reading lines. And he is now using his acting experience to produce something new in TV politics: instant ads. Linda Ellerby reports.
An Ohio meat market, and for one day, yesterday, a television studio. It is to be a commercial, and it's to air only 9 hours later. Politics meets TV technology. The airtime is bought, the schedule's tight, it's 2 p.m.
3, 2, 1, and cue, please.
I've been campaigning today in western Ohio, and I'm speaking to you now from Lima, a community of about 50,000 people.
John, please.
What?
60,000 instead of 50,000, Governor. The population of Lima.
Oh, well, the script I saw originally said 50.
It's right on the prompter, sir.
Ads produced and aired in the same day allow them to show Reagan out there, campaigning, and give him a chance to respond to anything President Carter might say without filtering the message through reporters.
I read the whole script. I kept waiting for that place where I was going to say ad lib.
You didn't say that.
Oh, there it is. Oh.
About feeling sorry for people.
Well, because...
So then he does ad lib, and very well.
I feel the deepest sympathy for you wives and mothers who have to deal with this every day in the marketplace, shopping for the family.
All right, from the top.
What was wrong with the ad lib? I liked that ad lib. The last one.
It's never easy in television, Governor, as you know. But when it was done, they loved it in Lima.
Well, thank you very much.
That, in a way, is the easy part. Now the governor goes one way and the tape goes the other to Columbus, Ohio, where it will be edited.
I'm here at a grocery store in Lima.
6 p.m. The spot will air on CBS at 10:55 Eastern Standard Time.
Good.
10:15, the tape is fed from Columbus to CBS New York, and when the movie ends...
Channel 2, Chicago. From Lima, Ohio,
Reagan intends to try these instant commercials 3 times a week up until election. High-speed technology. But it will be more helpful when the commercial doesn't have to play against the World Series, as it did last night. Linda Ellerby, NBC.
There are 17 days of campaigning to go, and the Carter-Reagan debate could end up being the central event in the last weeks of the contest. So far, in the opinion of many politicians and journalists, it hasn't been much of a campaign. Tom Pettit, who has covered a lot of it, looks back on what's happened so far.
The campaign of 1980 has been marked by a few flat notes. It is a rocky campaign, lacking in distinction. Reagan locked in combat with Carter, each straining now for advantage, both almost ignoring Anderson. More than 30 years ago, Harry Truman came from far behind to win an upset by taking a train to most of the country and becoming Give 'em Hell Harry. This campaign has taken Give 'em Heck Jimmy and Ronnie all over the eastern industrial states, largely ignoring everything west of the Mississippi except Texas and California. If Carter goes into a coal mine with a helmet, Reagan goes to Temple with a yarmulke.
This president will never do.
If Carter is heckled by protesting Jews, Reagan is heckled by students who do not think all air is clean. If Carter gets Kennedy and company, Reagan gets Ralph David Abernathy. Trying to make the economy the issue, Reagan has had some success with the unemployed and the working class voter. He also was trying to run a campaign of minimal mistakes, which meant sitting on a lead for weeks. While Carter was pursuing but not finding a consistent style, he was attacking Reagan on Social Security and health care and scoring, but scoring the most by making out Reagan to be soft on peace.
It's necessary for a nation to have a strong military force, but the best weapon is one that's never fired in combat.
I've been very busy, as you know, starting nuclear wars.
Still, Reagan has not been able to laugh off the so-called issue of war and peace. Polls show that women, even Republicans, are worried about Reagan on this issue. Reagan will buy time on TV to show he is a peacemonger.
It is difficult to prove you will not start World War III, but that may be what Reagan has to do now to win. Tom Pettit, NBC News, New York.
President Carter told the Associated Press he does not expect the debate set for the 28th in Cleveland to decide this election. As to who will win, Mr. Carter said he doesn't know. Well, Ronald Reagan wouldn't even go that far. He refuses to speculate on the importance of the debate, much less on the outcome. Heidi Schulman with the Reagan campaign in Illinois. Ronald Reagan went home to his alma mater, Eureka College, last night, where he was cheered on by his 86-year-old college football coach, Mac McKenzie.
And tomorrow, I hope they win one for the Gippers.
The Reagan camp concedes the election is on the line in the last 2 weeks, that here in Illinois and in places like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, it could go either way. As Reagan bussed across central and southern Illinois today, an aide speculated that the president is still trying to pull off the much-touted October surprise. But confronted with new talk of movement in the hostage situation, Reagan said he doesn't care who benefits politically from their release.
I don't care when they're returned, anytime, or who tries to make anything out of it. We want them home, and I'd welcome anything that'll bring them home.
At Illinois State University this morning, chanting ERA demonstrators lined the parade route. The Reagan camp is concerned that ERA and President Carter's charge that Reagan is prone to war are hurting him with women. His promise on Monday to name a woman to the Supreme Court was designed to prove his good faith on equal rights. Tomorrow night, he'll try to demonstrate his command of foreign policy in a half-hour national television address. Today, Reagan was asked if he's worried about the race tightening up.
I've had the nightmare all along. I have never believed anything but that in challenging an incumbent, I'm the underdog.
Reagan won't speculate on what his debate with Jimmy Carter will mean to the contest, but as he campaigned in Lincoln Country, aides called it a risk he had to take. They hope that the buildup for the debate will lessen Jimmy Carter's momentum and put the campaign on hold at a time they believe Reagan is still ahead. Heidi Schulman, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Illinois. Independent candidate John Anderson will not take part in that debate, but as Bob Jameson reports, Anderson continues to take on Mr. Carter and Mr. Reagan on the campaign trail.
John Anderson arrived in Minneapolis today, resolved to carry on despite a week filled with unmistakable signs that his campaign has come as far as it will go. The most devastating blow was the League of Women Voters' decision that his candidacy was no longer serious enough to include him in its crucial debate later this month. He greeted that with the kind of brave talk that characterized his reaction to every bit of bad news this week.
What is there about poll figures, given their wild fluctuation in a single week, that entitles them to make a decision?
The League's decision may only speed the decline in his support, which fell to a single-digit 8% in this week's Gallup poll. Still, Anderson promised a last-minute surge.
The polls are going to have the worst time they've had since the Literary Digest poll elected Alf Landon in 1936.
But mixed with the bravado have been bitter words and scorn for President Carter, ridicule for Ronald Reagan. Through it all, Anderson believes with an evangelist passion that he is the best candidate, that only he is willing to address the tough issues facing America.
I'm not running around the country trying to scare anybody, as I think Mr. Carter has done. I'm certainly not running around the country trying to anesthetize the country, the way Mr. Reagan has been doing.
If Anderson will not admit that there is no hope left, aides say he is undergoing a fundamental change in the closing days of the campaign. The stiff, strident campaigner of last spring is gone. Anderson no longer worries about his money troubles, no longer worries about strategy. He is merely running in a campaign for posterity. Bob Jamison, NBC News, with the Anderson campaign in Minneapolis.
Negotiators for President Carter and Ronald Reagan met for several long hours today, but were not able to reach formal agreement on where the presidential debate will be held or when. This does not mean that there will be no debate. It does mean that both sides are trying to position their candidates to get the most out of the debate. Details from Steve Delaney.
Early today, Reagan negotiator James Baker said the debate ought to be on the night before the election. But Carter campaign chief Robert Strauss didn't like that idea.
Frequently when there are misstatements made and factual misstatements, even if unintentional, you need 24 to 48 hours to clean them up. And I would think that would be one reason we would be rather negative on it.
In 5 hours of spirited negotiating with representatives of the League of Women Voters, Baker and Strauss dropped the election eve debate date and the idea of a vice presidential debate. They did not agree on the details of a Carter-Reagan debate.
We discussed place, we discussed date, we discussed format, and we made considerable progress.
That's all anyone would say until tomorrow, when the League hopes to announce an agreement. President Carter wants as direct a confrontation with Reagan as he can get. Reagan's people prefer an indirect face-off with a bigger role for panelist and a moderator. Carter's aides want the debate next Sunday, the 26th, believing that more people watch TV on Sunday nights. Reagan's people have not responded to the League's suggestion, Tuesday, the 28th. Also unsettled, what time the debate should be, how long it should run, and what they'll talk about. What is settled now, after a weekend of doubt, is that the League of Women Voters will be the sponsor. And that suggests that the debate will be in Cleveland, where the League stands ready to stage it on whatever day is selected tomorrow. Steve Delaney, NBC News, Washington.
Ronald Reagan was on the road today trying to counter the Carter campaign's charge that he is not trustworthy in matters of war and peace. Reagan said the danger of accidental war is greater if Carter is president because of what Reagan called Carter's vacillation. And Reagan got a little help from Henry Kissinger. Chris Wallace reports.
Reagan stepped up his peace offensive today, seeking to ease concerns that as president he would start a war. He met with Republican foreign policy experts on a flight to Ohio, a meeting repeatedly interrupted so photographers could take pictures. Former Secretary of State William Rogers came back to reporters with a seal of approval.
He is not a warmonger. His principal objective as President of the United States will be to seek peace.
The group endorsed Reagan's call for an arms buildup while negotiating a new weapons treaty with the Soviets. Henry Kissinger, who started negotiations on SALT II, said that treaty should be scrapped because conditions have changed.
I support the governor's proposal of a new long-term negotiation within the framework of which we can then work out some interim measures.
Reagan defended his call for a weapons buildup, saying the weak Carter foreign policy is far more dangerous. But he tried to be as unthreatening as possible.
The President of the United States seems to be determined to have me start a nuclear war. Well, I'm just as determined that I'm not going to.
Throughout the campaign, Reagan has tried to stay off the defensive, but the peace issue has become so damaging, he will spend most of this week talking about it, hoping to persuade voters their real worry is domestic issues. This afternoon in Cincinnati, he hit one of those issues, telling Catholic educators he supports tuition tax credits. This evening, a riverboat ride in Kentucky, one of the border and southern states where Reagan's strong defense stance may help him. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Louisville.
And President Carter was on the road. Before Reagan got Kissinger's endorsement on the SALT Treaty, the president was busy attacking Reagan's position on arms control. John Palmer was traveling with the president.
As he was leaving the White House for a day of campaigning, Mr. Carter made the first of several attacks on Reagan's arms control proposals, calling them naive and charging that Reagan, in Mr. Carter's words, doesn't understand the serious consequences of his policy.
It would be a devastating and perhaps fatal blow to the long-term process of nuclear arms control, a process that has been nurtured and pursued by every president of the United States, Republican and Democrat, since Harry Truman.
Later, as the president toured the economically depressed steel-producing region of western Pennsylvania, he returned to the same theme, telling a campaign rally, Reagan's plan is unworkable.
What would you think if President Brezhnev made a speech and said that the nuclear arms control treaty that we have negotiated over a 7-year period, that he was going to throw it in the wastebasket?
Carter campaign aides believe they have now engaged Governor Reagan in what they think has become the central issue of this campaign, the so-called war and peace issue, and they intend to bring it up every day between now and Election Day. Later in New York, Reagan's name came up again.
And I predict to you that after November the 4th, he'll be right back where he's been the last 20 years, in Hollywood as a movie actor.
John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in New York.
And beyond the war and peace issue, one of the other issues in the campaign is the readiness of American military forces. I asked both President Carter and Governor Reagan to comment on this, as well as the new Rapid Deployment Force, and here's what they said. The president says, quote, "Our forces are more ready now than when I became president." Do you agree with that?
No. Nor do I believe that top men in uniform agree with that.
The president says that the Rapid Deployment Force is well on its way to becoming a reality. Do you agree with that?
It's on its way to becoming a reality. I've read statements by the Marine General who is in command of that, but he also at the same time has made plain that there are still great deficiencies that it could not be deployed at the present. The problem is his defense policies have been such that is that just rhetoric? What capability do we have? What could we do? The president's statements about force in the Middle East, he knows. In fact, there's been an admission from Washington since that statement was made that we don't really have that force.
Well, you have to realize what I inherited. When I came in this office in the 8 years before I arrived here, 7 of those years we'd had a substantial decrease in the budgetary commitment of funds for the military. Since I've been in office, every year we've had a steady, predictable, well-planned increase above and beyond the inflationary rate in building a better defense. We have put forward a 15-year program to improve NATO, a major alliance in Western Europe. And we've begun now to build up a rapid deployment force which can stretch to troubled areas of the world an adequate American force very quickly to protect our interests there, primarily to be used as a deterrent. I think it's important to point out that these changes do take time, but the steady progress toward very attractive goals for our nation and its defense capability, that progress is being carried out without delay, in an orderly fashion, understood and supported by the members of the Congress. You can't do it overnight.
Tomorrow evening, our series on the candidates and the issues will continue, and we'll hear them talking about taxes and how they can be cut. The presidential election is, at the moment, a very, very close contest. Among the groups which believe that is the NBC News Election Unit, which makes weekly surveys of the candidates standing in the various states. With 2 weeks to go to the election, here's how it looks to us. States solid for Reagan in blue, leaning to Reagan in diagonal blue lines. The same for Carter in red. The white states are toss-ups as of now, and they're the key. 15 of them, 204 electoral votes, all of them too close to call. Carter is having trouble in his home base, the South. We now believe that Arkansas is solid for Carter, but we have moved both Alabama and South Carolina into the toss-up category. Both were leaning to Carter in our earlier survey, and we now believe Florida, a toss-up earlier, is leaning to Reagan, an important shift. Trouble in the South for the first Southerner elected president in a long time. We show no changes in Reagan's western base. Oregon still leaning to Reagan, California still solid, Texas a toss-up. The only change in the east is in Rhode Island, which we have moved into the safe for Carter category. In the Middle West, we still show Ohio leaning to Reagan, with two other important states, Illinois and Michigan, so close that no judgment can be made. Michigan has 21 electoral votes, the 7th largest share in the country. Carter needs it badly this year, and black voters could make the difference. Ken Bodie is in Detroit.
The black vote is crucial to Jimmy Carter in this election, especially in a swing state like Michigan. In Detroit, Carter needs 85 to 90% of the black vote to offset Republican majorities upstate. The most powerful black politician in this state is Detroit Mayor Coleman Young.
When you get 10 or 11% of the vote that's concentrated in one area, as the black vote is, and then if you can turn that vote out, it could be decisive and a key vote.
Turnout is the key. The economy is at its worst in the black community. Indifference is the prevailing political climate. To overcome that, the Democrats have begun to escalate the rhetoric about Reagan.
He's anti-poor, he's anti-black, he's anti-labor. He scares me.
It's no accident that the Reagan campaign picked a place like Michigan for the Reverend Ralph Abernathy's endorsement.
Ronald Reagan is desperate to find any person with a black skin who would speak out.
Jimmy Carter needs Michigan this time, and one means to help get it is the federal spigot. In the last 7 weeks, Michigan has received $290 million in federal grants and loans, much of it to Detroit, including $25 million to fix up this housing project, another $1 million for unemployed workers, and $25 million more in transportation grants. For much of this, Coleman Young, Jimmy Carter's favorite mayor, gets political credit.
He's my favorite president. I think he's been pretty good to Detroit on the basis of, and that's what's attractive about his urban policy. The federal aid is allocated on the basis of need.
And one thing is for certain, Jimmy Carter needs Coleman Young. Ken Bodie, NBC News, Detroit.
Good evening. With just 2 weeks to go before the presidential election, both major party candidates today were talking about the American hostages in Iran. At least for now, the delicate situation of the hostages is a political issue in this campaign. Ronald Reagan began talking about the hostages last night after the president and the Secretary of State responded to questions about them. Chris Wallace was with Reagan today.
Reagan brought up the hostages last night, saying he didn't understand why the 52 Americans had been held captive so long. Leaving his hotel this morning, Reagan toughened the attack.
They've been there. It will be election day unless they suddenly are released. It will be 1 year. I believe that this administration's foreign policy helped create the entire situation that made their kidnap possible. And I think the fact that they've been there that long is a humiliation and a disgrace to this country.
Top aides said Reagan was taking the offensive on the war and peace issue. Brought up the hostages as one example of the president's weak foreign policy. They said Reagan is aware the situation may now be at a delicate stage, but was being careful about what he said. Reagan was very careful when asked repeatedly during the day how he would get the hostages out.
Question, do you think you could get them out?
Thank you.
I don't know, but I certainly wouldn't stand by and do nothing.
I think I've had some ideas, but you don't talk about them, and maybe that's been one of the problems. He's done all his negotiating in the press. That is not quiet diplomacy.
The Reagan camp has long worried about what an October surprise could do to this election, and with just 2 weeks to go, knows it may be coming true. Their strategy, according to one aide, is to hit the president on the hostages, figuring that if Mr. Carter gets them home, it doesn't matter what they say. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Herrin, Illinois.
And after Reagan talked about the hostages today, President Carter had his own comments. John Palmer is traveling with the Carter campaign.
President Carter, campaigning in Florida, responded to Governor Reagan's charge, saying Reagan has broken his pledge not to inject the negotiations for the hostages into the campaign.
Well, the fate of the hostages is too important to the hostages, to the families, and to our country to be made a political football. I will not make any statement that would tend to complicate an already very sensitive situation. Throughout this year, candidates have tried to refrain from this temptation. In September, I believe it was, September 13th, Governor Reagan pledged to the American people that he would not inject the negotiations for the hostages into the political campaign. I regret that he has broken this pledge.
Later, the White House said Mr. Carter does not plan to ask Reagan for the ideas which Reagan says he has for getting the hostages home, nor will the State Department make any contact with Reagan concerning the matter. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Orlando, Florida.
There were some signals from Iran yesterday which indicated that the parliament there would soon set conditions for the release of the hostages, and things did look a bit more hopeful. But today the situation darkened. Prime Minister Rajaei met with the Ayatollah Khomeini and came out to say Iran won't negotiate on the hostages even to get spare parts for its military. And the Ayatollah was quoted as saying that President Carter himself must be tried. Khomeini seemed to be saying there would be no movement now on the hostages. All of this back and forth has been watched with great interest at the State Department. Marvin Kalb has more on that.
Intelligence experts with no political axis to grind think that Iran's position on the hostage issue has hardened in the past 24 hours. Perhaps, they say, in response to recent comments by President Carter about lifting sanctions against Iran in return for the hostages' release. It seems that every time the president makes a proposal in public, the Iranians feel the need to react negatively. Secretary of State Muskie, acknowledging that the U.S. has had setbacks and disappointments before, hopes that Prime Minister Rajai's hardline statement today does not represent the final word from Iran. But Muskie said in St. Louis that the U.S. is ready to negotiate with Iran at any time, any place, even Tehran, even by a high-ranking American official going there, if only the Iranians would give the green light. But the experts here say there is a vicious power struggle now going on in Tehran with the hostages caught between two rival groups. But it's felt here that the pressures of the war with Iraq may yet tip the scales in favor of those in Iran who want to strike a deal with the United States. Marvin Kalb, NBC News, the State Department.
And the government of Iraq, at war with Iran, said today that any American help for Iran would be considered direct American involvement in the war. The Iraqi foreign minister said the hostage issue should not serve as an opportunity for the United States to become involved in the war through supplying Iran. This afternoon reached agreement on the location, the date, and the time of the presidential debate between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. The League of Women Voters, the sponsor of the debate, announced that it will take place on October 28th, a Tuesday, in Cleveland at 9:30 in the evening, and we believe the length will be an hour and a half. Our presentation of campaign issues tonight is about cutting taxes. The president says Reagan's plan is based mainly on tax cuts for individuals. Only 10% of Reagan's plan, according to the president, calls for a reduction in business taxes. 90% of the plan involves personal tax cuts. Here's what Reagan said about that.
I haven't worked it out as to percentage over a 5-year period is what he's talking about. I don't know that it might be 90-10, but there's no question that there is a bigger reduction for individuals than there is for business and industry. But I think that we have adequate provision in there for the accelerated depreciation and to give business and industry what it needs to refurbish plant, modernize, catch up with the rest of the industrial nations in the world. The individual tax, however, I think is not out of line, since the thing the president doesn't talk about, and very pointedly doesn't talk about, is the fact that due to him, there is built into our tax structure now a tax increase that will amount to more than $80 billion increase alone next year, and by 5 years from now will be more than $500 billion a year additional tax. And therefore, my tax cut that he seems to think is so horrendous is nothing more than a reduction of the increase.
What Governor Reagan's proposal would do would be to fan the fires of inflation very hotly by having consumer buying capability built up a very great amount when the supply of goods and the provision of jobs and the reconstitution of the modern plants and equipment were not addressed directly. Our proposal, on the other hand, has at least 50% of its benefit go to encourage modernization of American plants and encouragement of investment and the building of American jobs. Its net effect, instead of being highly inflationary, is actually anti-inflationary in nature. So the combination of providing new jobs, modernizing American industrial plants, and at the same time controlling or reducing inflation is what I propose. This is obviously much better.
Independent candidate John Anderson is now running the first television ads he's had on the air since last spring. Linda Ellerby has had a look.
I start with some hard facts, and so must America.
And so must John Anderson. Hard fact. It doesn't look like he's going to win. So why now start spending so much money on television commercials?
The campaign is managed by David Garth, and David Garth is the media consultant. And David Garth has a pretty good record on other campaigns. But this time he has less than $2 million to spend, and that only recently.
Obviously, Anderson is a long shot in this race, but people are shying away from committing themselves to Reagan and Carter. One of the difficulties we have had in the campaign is not being able to be on television when our opponents have had about $30 million to spend, at least on television, if they wanted to. And so we have to go to the tube because we think this election is going to be decided in the last 10 days.
So the first commercial goes after the unhappy Carter and Reagan supporter, and rather bluntly.
Multi-billion-dollar tax cuts proposed by my opponents sound good. I can't support them.
That's number one. And it goes straight to what is the basis of the Reagan platform and some of the Carter platform, too.
A $100 billion MX missile sounds tough. I'm against it.
MX missile? Certainly a favorite of the administration.
ERA, absolutely.
Something that Reagan walked away from in his platform.
And I'm repelled by those TV preachers who call themselves a moral majority.
In a strange way, it's been hung with Ronald Reagan calling the moral majority. A lot of people forget that in 1976, Jimmy Carter appealed to that very same group. And it was Jimmy Carter who gave us that phrase, ethnic purity. Every poll we've seen indicates that Anderson just about hurts equally. Maybe there's 1 or 2 point difference, Carter and Reagan. And they'd like us to disappear. We're just not going to.
Well, then why aren't the Reagan people wanting you to disappear as badly as the Carter people are?
Oh, I would think the Reagan people have just demonstrated they do.
By the debate?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Reagan agreeing to debate without Anderson may mean he's worried about him, but it's still going to be hard to overcome the effects of being excluded from the debate, even with television advertising. Linda Ellerby, NBC News.
Presidential campaign maneuvering today. Chris Wallace reports that Ronald Reagan, who is having problems with support from women, has arranged for television ads to be done by his wife and Betty Ford, the wife of the former president. Reagan also expects former Senator Eugene McCarthy himself, an independent candidate in 1976, to endorse the Reagan-Bush ticket. President Carter, perhaps responding to Reagan's appearance on TV Sunday night, said today a president can't rely on 3x5 cards and a teleprompter. Ronald Reagan, on the campaign trail, said today that one option he might consider as president would be a total embargo of trade, a total break-off of trade with the Soviet Union if Soviet aggression warranted such a move. And Reagan talked again about an arms race with Moscow, saying the Soviets could not win it since their economy is already overburdened with the production of arms. There was one subject which Reagan did not talk about today. Chris Wallace reports.
This morning, Reagan backed out of the hostage controversy that he started 2 days ago, refusing to answer any questions on the subject.
I am not going to comment on this anymore because it is so obvious how they tried to make a political issue of this, and with 52 human beings at stake, I'm not going to discuss it. I'm not going to touch on it at all.
Top Reagan aides said they'd been surprised with the strong White House reaction and did not want a prolonged fight over the hostages. They also felt they'd made their point. The president has been unable to free the 52 Americans. Earlier in an interview, Reagan acknowledged the president has made points against him, saying Mr. Carter has been effective in creating a warmonger stereotype of Reagan. Reagan added, "I don't think there is anyone in this country that is more in favor of peace than I am." But as he campaigned through the South, Reagan ended 3 days of defending himself on the peace issue and turned to the theme aides say he will emphasize through the election: Jimmy Carter's competence.
I submit that after 3.5 years, the inflation rate we have, 8 million unemployed in the country, the energy crisis still going on, our currency of such low value that it is the least desirable perhaps in the world today, where it once was the most desirable, that the man who is asking for 4 more years is incompetent to do the job.
In these final days, Reagan is trying to win over undecided voters, especially women. But today, he may have suffered a setback. Reagan announced the formation of domestic task forces with 329 advisors. Fewer than 25 of them are women. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Columbus, Mississippi.
And President Carter was also campaigning in the South today. Mr. Carter was busy attacking Reagan on a number of fronts. John Palmer was with the president.
Mr. Carter was in a fighting mood as he campaigned hard for Texas's valuable 26 electoral votes. When he was given a pair of Western boots, he said he would use them to stomp the Republicans in Texas. He toured a newly built offshore oil rig and in a speech to shipyard workers lashed out at Reagan, portraying him as an enemy of Social Security and Medicare. Wearing his new boots at his next stop, he accused the Republicans of, in the president's words, spreading a lot of manure around. He compared what he called Reagan's secret plan for getting the hostages home with former President Nixon's plan to end the war in Vietnam.
Do you remember when Richard Nixon said just before an election in 1968 that he had a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam? You all remember that? How many of you Texans with sound judgment, familiar with history, believe that Ronald Reagan has a secret plan to get the hostages back? How many of you think so?
Mr. Carter's once solid political base in the South has been eroded. It's generally conceded he's behind now in the state of Texas. He is hoping that Senator Kennedy's popularity with Mexican-American voters will help pull him ahead.
Kennedy campaigned for Mr. Carter in the Hispanic neighborhoods of San Antonio today, where the Kennedy name is still magic. But Kennedy is avoiding conservative areas of the state where he's less popular. With 800,000 registered Hispanic voters in Texas, Carter aides believe Kennedy's help could make the difference. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Texas.
In the old days of presidential politics, they were called voting blocks. Today, when computers track the opinions and movements of millions of voters, they're called target voters or target groups. The candidates pay very special attention to them. Black voters, Jewish voters, Hispanic voters, and a very important target group this year, blue-collar voters. Roger O'Neill has looked at some of them.
They work in the sprawling factories in the industrial centers like the 20th Congressional District in Cleveland. They are construction workers, repairmen, some wear hard hats. All work with their hands, but it's their pocketbooks that are hurting. They are worried about their jobs and disgusted with the promises of politicians.
How can you possibly win in this election? Somebody tell me how I can win, or how this man can win. I don't see how.
We're both going to be in the same spot, right in the bread line, right there, you know. We're both going to be looking for a job.
Hello, my name is Jackie. I'm a union member calling on behalf of the AFL-CIO to remind our members that Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale have been friends to working men and women.
Labor unions are important here, but nationally 60% of blue-collar workers are non-union. Like their membership, the union power to influence votes is diminishing. Blue-collar workers in the 20th District live in suburbs like Brook Park, close to where they work. They are family people, churchgoers.
and like working class people everywhere, finding it hard to make ends meet on their average wage of $14,000 a year. They tend to socialize with other blue-collar workers, bowling at Brookgate Lanes, dancing at Carlin's Social Club, or playing bingo at St. Joseph's Church. The blue-collar worker feels forgotten by the politicians.
They're going out of their way, worrying about other people besides the people right here in the United States.
The small people, the blue-collar people, are losing out. They're losing out.
Governor Reagan has targeted in on the blue-collar, traditional Democratic voter, and he's been making progress.
I'm going to vote for Reagan this year.
President Carter is still expected to win the blue-collar vote, but the important question is by how much.
I don't know whether to vote for the peanut farmer or the movie star.
There are a lot of Fred Kitchens undecided. As many as 1 out of every 5 voters hasn't made up his mind yet. And one reason why, according to a Republican county official here, is that many blue-collar workers think all politicians are bums. And yet most blue-collar workers will vote, even though they don't like the choices. Roger O'Neill, NBC News, Cleveland. Our Issues interview with Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan this evening deals with the environment, and specifically the environment in that part of Alaska called the Arctic Wildlife Preserve. Beautiful to see, lots of oil under part of it. The answers this evening show us more than what the candidates feel about Alaska. When they talk about that, they are expressing their philosophies of conservation.
About 95% of the land area of Alaska is open for oil exploration, and we're just beginning to make those exploratory well drillings. The other 5% of Alaska's land is especially precious. It's extraordinarily beautiful, it's pure, it's the grounds within which certain species of animals or plant life are located, and it'll be many decades or generations in the future before there's any real need to violate the character of that land in order to search for new oil and gas. So I think that combination has been adequately expressed in the Alaska Lands legislation. It's something that I think we ought to preserve.
And were you referring to the Arctic Wildlife Preserve when you
Yes, that's part of it. It certainly is. And later, if we find that we've explored all the other areas that are not so precious, then decades in the future, those additional lands can be opened for very carefully controlled exploratory wells that don't violate the environmental quality of our world.
I think there are things that you would not destroy. Irreplaceable beauty spots, unusual features that the environment should be the prime consideration. Now, how do we know, is this so unique? Or is this something that, say, that particular kind of scenery is duplicated in the hundreds and hundreds of millions of acres of Alaska land? This Arctic Wildlife Preserve is a giant stretch of mainly tundra. And the spot they're talking about then is right up in the one corner closest to Prudhoe Bay. It is believed to have a potential as great or greater than Prudhoe Bay, and it amounts to 0.1% of the Arctic Wildlife Preserve. Now, I don't believe the caribou would measure that carefully, that they would worry about 0.1% as long as they had 99.9 left.
Tomorrow night, we'll hear more from the candidates on the issues. Ronald Reagan said today that Jimmy Carter may not be competent to handle the job of president. Reagan's rhetoric is heating up. He was talking today about what he calls Carter's demonstrated inability to govern our nation. It was a day when the Reagan campaign wasn't talking about the American hostages in Iran, only thinking about them. Chris Wallace reports.
The possibility of a hostage release looked as threatening to the Reagan camp today as the clouds in the West Florida sky. Reagan continued to refuse comment on the hostages, saying he did not want to endanger them. But top aides talk constantly about the credit the president would get for their release, and they admit they're searching for a way to respond. Campaigning in St. Petersburg, Reagan tried to turn attention back to the Carter record, charging the president has shown an inability to govern.
He has not answered for the economic misery that he's created. He has not accounted for the aimless direction of his policy. He refuses to accept the blame for what has happened. Instead, he points the finger at others, anyone in sight.
Reagan is trying to make Mr. Carter the issue, but today he started a new issue of his own, telling the Detroit News he would declare the Panama Canal Treaty null and void if the canal's neutrality were threatened. Reagan has long opposed the treaty, but explained later he's not about to break it.
You guys insist on hypothetical questions. I gave you a hypothetical answer. Not if you honestly report that you guys, that somebody kept pressing and pressing and wanted to know. I can't foresee down the road that there might not be somebody, and I made that very plain in my answer.
This afternoon in South Carolina, Reagan again attacked Mr. Carter's economic record and raised the possibility the administration will, quote, Jimmy the Consumer Price Index, which comes out tomorrow, to hide the effects of inflation. Reagan will spend most of the next 5 days preparing for the debate, and top aides now are thankful for that opportunity, saying that if the hostages are released, the debate may be Reagan's last chance to remind voters there are other issues. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Greenville, South Carolina.
The Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who supports Reagan, said today he believes that if Reagan is elected, he will maintain black representation on the Supreme Court should Justice Thurgood Marshall leave the bench. President Carter was at the White House getting the support of the man who replaced Abernathy as head of an influential black organization. John Palmer reports.
President Carter met with Joseph Lowery, president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, just a week after Lowery's predecessor, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, endorsed Governor Reagan. After today's meeting, Lowery, saying he was speaking only for himself, endorsed President Carter.
I am frightened that the forces of insensitivity, of racism, of militarism, of violence, of negativism are gravitating in and toward the candidacy of Governor Reagan.
Later, the president told a group of several hundred black ministers that the Justice Department and the FBI are assisting in the tracking down of those he called depraved human beings who have been carrying out random killings of blacks in Buffalo, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia.
It's a blight on our economy. It's a blight on our society. It's a blight on our country to have this done. And those kinds of people and the Ku Klux Klan have got to be caught, brought to justice, prove that they violated law, and put under the jail where they belong.
Then the session took on the atmosphere of a revival meeting.
Absolutely. I believe I was put here on a purpose, and I believe you all came to the White House this afternoon on a purpose. And if you and I can get together, I guarantee you that the Republicans will not sit in the Oval Office for the next 8 years, right? I'm with you. Thank you.
The meeting ended with a spontaneous singing of Mr. Carter's favorite hymn, Amazing Grace. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign at the White House.
Former Senator Eugene McCarthy, an independent candidate for president in 1976, today endorsed Ronald Reagan for president. McCarthy described himself as enthusiastic enough about Reagan to support him. Independent candidate John Anderson was in Detroit today, where he called upon President Carter to make public what he's done to obtain the release of the American hostages. More on that from Bob Jameson.
Any industrial policy.
Anderson said the president should make a public accounting to allay suspicions he is cutting a deal with Iran because of the election.
I don't think we want October surprises. I don't think we want to feel that we have decided this election on the basis of some sleight of hand.
Anderson accused the president of politicizing the issue in the first place, using it as an excuse to duck a debate with Senator Kennedy. It is ill grace, he said, for Mr. Carter to now criticize Ronald Reagan's use of the issue.
They have been in chains for almost a year, and silence on the issue, some conspiracy of silence, and labeling whether it's Teddy Kennedy or somebody else as somehow almost traitorous. If you talk about the issue, I don't know of anybody that's produced any convincing arguments, and surely no evidence that has kept those people in captivity one day longer.
Anderson warned that a full disclosure is especially important now because of the broad implications any deal would have. Bob Jameson, NBC News, with the Anderson.
One of the key target groups in the 1980 presidential election is the bloc of Mexican Americans who live in Texas. Mexican Americans represent 14% of the registered vote in Texas. If President Carter's re-election should depend on Texas, the Mexican Americans will make the difference. Robin Lloyd reports.
The Mexican American vote is extremely important for Jimmy Carter. He needs a huge margin among Mexican Americans to carry this state, and no Democrat has ever been elected president without Texas. So Carter brought in Senator Edward Kennedy to encourage a large turnout. Mexican Americans still revere the Kennedys. During the primaries, Kennedy took the Texas Hispanic vote from Carter, capturing 68% of it. But in the 1976 presidential elections, this was Carter country. He took 87% of the Mexican American vote in Texas. Local Democrats hope he can do it again this year and carry Texas with Kennedy's help.
We will win this election by a narrow margin, just as we did in 1976, but we'll win it.
But people like Carmen Meneses, who came to see Kennedy, are disillusioned with Jimmy Carter. Like many other Mexican Americans, she thinks he's made too many mistakes. It's Kennedy she wants as president. Her house is full of Kennedy memorabilia. Even though Senator Edward Kennedy has asked her to vote for Carter, she's not sure she can.
I've talked to plenty friends of mine, and they want to vote Democrat, but still leave Carter out.
The Republicans believe the support for Carter is not there this year. They see Mexican Americans becoming more independent, less tied to the Democratic machine.
And no longer can you say that a Hispanic is born Catholic and has to vote Democrat. So that the change is here.
A big question remains: how large a turnout Edward Kennedy has attracted? How many still remain too disillusioned to vote? Most Mexican Americans are still loyal to the Kennedys. It remains to be seen, however, whether Ted Kennedy can succeed in transferring that loyalty to Jimmy Carter. Robin Lloyd, NBC News, San Antonio.
Texas, we rate as a toss-up right now, a problem for Jimmy Carter, the first president from Georgia. He's got troubles in his southern base. Here's how we see the South as of now. Only Georgia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and West Virginia seem solid for Carter, seen here in solid red. The white states are undecided. Tom Pettit reports from Alabama on the southern situation.
The Deep South is a key to Reagan's success in 1980, as it was for Carter in 1976. Demopolis is in Alabama, a target state for both candidates this time.
No Republican or Democratic presidential candidate ever has come to Demopolis, ever.
From Kentucky and other border states southward to the Gulf, from Louisiana to Florida to Mississippi, native Southerner Carter is challenged by Reagan, a natural son of the region's conservative philosophy. Voters in Demopolis, white or black, have seen no big presidential rallies here.
But if Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan were to visit here, he would find people still choosing up sides, many reluctantly.
I wouldn't follow Jimmy Carter to the corner.
At the Rexall drugstore this morning, disenchantment with Carter was epidemic.
We're judging Carter by his past record. We're letting him stand on his record. And even though he is a Southerner.
Carter has been a failure. We need now not a president for the South. We need a president for the United States.
Black Demopolis is quite different and indicative of greater black support for Carter than Reagan strategists had hoped.
As a Democrat, I'm going to vote for Carter.
Blacks gave Carter the presidency in 1976. He must hold up to win this time, especially in the South. And there will be pressure to turn out. Reverend Ernest Palmer, Demopolis.
I expect President Carter to bring about 95% of the black vote in Demopolis.
Why?
Because the leadership will make sure that's where it goes.
Black churches in Alabama will be contending for Carter against the pro-Reagan white power structure of small southern towns like this one. Even here, the result is expected to be very close. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Demopolis.
The election is 12 days away. That's Nightly News for this evening. I'm John Chancellor. Good night for NBC News.
Tomorrow morning on
This is NBC Nightly News with John Chancellor in New York.
Good evening. There were more rumors today that the American hostages in Iran may be released this weekend. Rumors which caused President Carter to issue a warning today against building up expectations. Here's how Mr. Carter put it on the campaign trail in New Jersey.
I don't have any way to know when the hostages might come home. And I think for us to expect that they're going to come home this weekend or next week or the following week is going to lead to very bitter disappointments in our country if they don't come home when we think they might.
Mr. Carter also said, as Vice President Mondale said this morning on the Today program, that it would be a mistake to predict a timetable for the return of the hostages. But at the United Nations, one diplomat in a position to know is saying just that barring a surprise, the release will be on Sunday. Bill McLaughlin has uncovered that aspect of the story.
A reliable and high-ranking Muslim diplomat here told me that last night he spoke with the Iranian leadership in Tehran. He spoke with Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Ali Rajaei and with the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, the Hojat-e-Salam Hashemi Rafsanjani. He was told by them that barring unforeseen circumstances, the American hostages would be released this Sunday. The source also cautioned us to ignore the wave of anti-American propaganda that would surround the release. It has to be done, he said, for domestic consumption. The technical details of the release through a third party, such as Switzerland or the United Nations, are now under discussion in Tehran. At the UN, the Security Council again met to discuss the Persian Gulf War, and again got nowhere. After the meeting, Iranian Special Envoy Ali Shams Ardakani had this to say about the hostages.
Say, look, we are ready to give you what belongs to you, give us what belongs to us.
Ardakani also spoke about the need for the help of a third party in the release of the hostages.
We need to create a mechanism to carry it out. And the mechanism has to be done between the two governments. Parliament is not involved in that anymore. I assume they would seek a third party or, some way to do it.
Could something go wrong? Of course. But the release of the hostages is now more than a possibility. Bill McLaughlin, NBC News, the United Nations.
Officials in the Reagan campaign say the possibility of a hostage return this weekend is more than rumor. The Reagan campaign now believes Secretary of State Muskie will go to West Germany on Sunday, where the hostages might be brought if they are released, and that the hostages may come out in 2 stages, on Sunday and Monday. According to one Reagan campaign official, some of the Iranian conditions for the release of the hostages may be met by an American agreement to take them to a world legal forum. And this official, who asked not to be named, said the United States will agree to send spare military parts to Iran. The Iranians have set forth 4 main conditions for the release of the hostages. The Iranians want the United States to renounce claims against Iran. They want a guarantee of no interference in their affairs. No problem there. What are problematical are the Iranian demands that the Shah's wealth be returned and that the Iranian assets frozen by the United States be unfrozen. Mike Jensen has looked into the frozen assets.
There are about 275 lawsuits being heard in courts all over the country, filed by businesses and banks owed money by Iran. They want part of the $8 billion in Iranian money and other assets that was frozen by President Carter, so Iran couldn't take it out of the country. Normally, private companies and banks like these, which are owed money by Iran, cannot legally get hold of a foreign government's assets. That's because there's a kind of diplomatic immunity for such money. It's like not being able to give parking tickets to foreign diplomats. But in this court in New York, a federal judge has ruled that the immunity was canceled when President Carter froze the Iranian assets, that companies could get their hands on Iranian money by filing lawsuits. Now President Carter is saying he would unfreeze the assets as part of a deal to get the hostages back. But there are problems. Legal experts say even if he did end the freeze, the legal cases would probably continue. That even if the diplomatic immunity for Iranian money was restored, it would take a lot of time for all those lawsuits to run their course so Iran could get its money back. And that it could leave a lot of American companies and banks holding the bag, with Iran owing them money and no Iranian assets to cover the debts. One possibility that's being discussed is to have the United States government assume responsibility for the money Iran owes American companies, or to form an international trade commission to sort things out. For the moment, because the subject of the hostages is so sensitive, nobody is saying much officially. Mike Jensen, NBC News, New York.
The figures for last month's consumer prices came out today, and they were not good news for President Carter. The consumer price index went up 1 full percent, and that's an annual rate of more than 12%. Irving R. Levine has more details.
It was at the supermarket that prices increased the most. Beef was up 1.6%, poultry up 4.8%, pork up 5%, and vegetables up 11.9%. The food price increases resulted from the drought last summer and from earlier cutbacks in livestock herds by farmers. Over the past month, Americans also paid more for clothing, for medical care, and for utilities. And after months of decline, used car prices rose as buyers turned away from the high price of new cars. And gasoline prices dipped slightly. At the White House, presidential advisor Stuart Eisenstadt tried to make the best of the figures.
Over the last 5 to 6 months, inflation has very clearly been brought down from its very high levels earlier in the year, and we think that that moderation will continue.
On the figures, at least, Eisenstadt is right. Inflation was running at 18.1% for the first 3 months of this year, at an 11.6% annual rate for the second quarter, and at 7% for the most recent 3 months, despite the latest upturn. But today's figures contribute to doubts that the moderation will continue. Food prices are likely to continue to climb. Mortgage interest rates have turned upward, and oil prices seem sure to go up again. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Washington.
Ronald Reagan said today's inflation figures demonstrate what Reagan called the utter failure of this administration's policies. But the president argued they show something very different. Here are 2 reports, the first from the Reagan camp.
The Reagan camp was overjoyed by the price figures, hoping they will shift voters' attention from foreign affairs back to the economy. Reagan was already scheduled to tape a speech on the economy for broadcast tonight. And on his way to the studio, he called today's index part of a continuing tragedy.
It demonstrates visibly the utter failure of the administration's policies. But aside from putting almost 2 million people out of work this year alone, inflation is still soaring, maintaining double-digit levels, and increasing.
In his broadcast, Reagan made no new proposals, but openly urged people to vote their pocketbooks in this election. Reagan's answer to inflation is traditional Republican budget cuts, almost $200 million over 5 years, which he promises to do without cutting any existing services.
Billions of dollars of waste, extravagance, fraud, and abuse in federal agencies simply are being ignored for all practical purposes by the Carter administration.
Reagan is having problems with women voters, so starting this weekend, the campaign will run commercials featuring the candidate's wife. Nancy Reagan says she is offended by the president's distortions about her husband on war and peace and the economy.
And the elderly people have enough to worry about now. They're scared to death of how they're going to make ends meet, how they're going to live without this thrown on top of them. That's a cruel thing to do.
Reagan aides say if the economy is the prime issue, their man will win, and that today's price figures are a good springboard for the last 10 days of this campaign. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Washington.
As President Carter campaigned for votes among blue-collar workers in Gloucester, New Jersey, today's bad economic news was very much on his mind. The president, looking at the new figures in the most favorable light possible, told a group of local residents the continued high inflation rate confirmed the wisdom of his policy of holding down government spending and opposing the election year tax cut proposed by the Republicans.
The proposal that we have advocated for next year, after the election, not during an election year, to have a tax stimulus to create new tools, new factories, new jobs for American workers is anti-inflationary in its impact. It will not only give us a better life, better jobs, but will cut down inflation. Governor Reagan, on the other hand, has proposed a so-called Reagan-Kemp-Roth proposal, which gives great rewards to rich people, but saddles the rest of us with enormous inflationary pressures. It's just like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Despite attempts to put as good a face as possible on the bad economic news, the new higher inflation rate represents a serious blow to the Carter campaign, coming as it does with a little more than a week before Election Day. John Palmer, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Gloucester, New Jersey.
Suburban residents, among many groups of Americans, are very worried about inflation. The latest in our series of reports about target voters, groups each candidate is trying especially hard to win over, is about suburbanites. And here's Roger O'Neill.
Carter, Reagan, and Anderson have all been trying to get aboard the train carrying white-collar suburban voters, but there's no easy ride for anyone this election. Nearly a quarter of the nation's workforce is white-collar, suburban, slightly more Republican than Democratic, women outnumbering men. from salespeople to dentists to card-playing corporate managers on the 520 train from Chicago to suburban Arlington Heights.
I really see no choice. As far as economic policies, I don't think either one of them have a plan that's going to get us out of the straits that we're in.
Illinois native son John Anderson is in the game. He's hurting Reagan more than Carter among these suburban voters. But as the election gets close, some of Anderson's players say they may pass.
I don't know that I really care to waste my vote on a candidate that I don't feel can win.
Suburban living is owning a home, having some space, the American dream. White-collar suburbanites are as worried about the economy as anyone else. Their quality of life is threatened, and they will fight to keep it.
I'm trying to survive, make a living for myself, my family, whatever.
I don't see the programs that Reagan has proposed as being ones that can control inflation.
The other thing that bothers me about Reagan is I feel his answers to policies are about 40 years old.
I think it's time that we try to see what a little less federal government means and see if it improves the economy. It's certainly doing a terrible job right now.
You look at Carter, and he's a loner. He goes off jogging on his own.
Yeah, what has Anderson ever done?
Does he have following?
All you're doing is saying that we don't have a candidate that's worth electing.
None of them are addressing the concerns as far as I'm concerned.
These 7 people did agree on one thing. They wish there were someone else to vote for. Roger O'Neill, NBC News, Arlington Heights, Illinois.
For the last couple of weeks, we've been hearing from candidates Carter and Reagan on various issues in the election. Tonight, it's John Anderson's turn. The independent candidate, who leads in no state in our survey, says he doesn't think that Carter and Reagan have really discussed issues.
Seems to me that issues have been raised in the sense that, yes, the word energy has been talked about. The word peace has been talked about. We've heard pronouncements on the economy, but not the kind of detailed, comprehensive information that indicates to me, or I think to the American people, that the president or his rival either has the foggiest notion of what they're going to do if the people do elect them on the 4th of November.
You think the American people have to be asked to bleed a little, Congressman? Is that leadership as you see it?
Realism would be a better word. I think we have to be far more realistic about what has to be done, where we are, what it will take to get from here to there. And realism, I think, has been lacking in the platforms and in the comments of the two traditional parties. And I think the American people are ready for some rather honest truths that may be harsh, may be unpalatable, but are necessary.
What are some of those harsh and unpalatable truths?
Well, I talked about energy, that we would have to really drastically reduce consumption. The only way to do it, I think, is by affecting the use of gasoline, which is the largest single product that comes out of that barrel of oil, barrel of petroleum. I think on the economy, you can't promise people a tax cut and then say that billions can be spent for defense, as both Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan are promising, without having inflation. I have said, no, I can't promise you a tax cut in 1981. We're going to have to use some of the, I know about bracket creep, but we're going to have to use some of that revenue, I think, to discharge some of the responsibilities that government has to meet our problems with respect to our cities, with respect to the poor, with respect to doing something about inadequate transportation systems, and yes, improving our conventional forces. I'm not against spending money to pay our soldiers and sailors and airmen more money to develop the kind of conventional equipment that would be usable in times of emergency, in contrast to what we've seen.
You've talked about the Anderson difference.
Yes.
Were you to be elected president, what would be the difference in terms of, let's begin with America's role in the world? What would be the difference?
I think rather than pouring billions of dollars of arms into the Middle East and into Africa and into Southeast Asia and every other part of the world, we have to begin to create more viable economic relationships with developing countries. It's going to take more money, to be sure, but I think the dividends would be far more substantial than what we are going to get from simply escalating the arms race.
What would the Anderson administration difference be in terms of its effect on the American economy?
Well, it would be a more disciplined economy. I have called for a wage price incentives program. I've said that the first thing I would do as president would be to get labor and business to sit down with me in the Oval Office and sit there as long as we had to sit until we decided on a satisfactory non-inflationary set of wage and price guidelines. Otherwise, we're simply going to be off on another round of inflation, I'm sure, as quickly as we begin to emerge from this recession.
You've been asked what you're going to do, win or lose, a great deal, but the possibility exists, as you are fully aware, that you might not be elected president.
All things are possible.
Now, you'll be celebrating your 62nd birthday when the New Hampshire primary is taking place in 1984.
Yeah.
Will we see John Anderson there if John Anderson doesn't succeed this time?
Well, I think it's a little early to engage in postmortems on a campaign that is still, I believe, going to succeed. But all things are possible, as we conceded a moment ago. I certainly want a role in the future life of this country. It doesn't have to be a political role, in the sense that I have to be running for office again. In the sense that I would be able to share with my fellow Americans my views, my attitudes, and maybe, if my ideas were worth anything, to help shape that consensus that has been so sadly lacking on some of these important questions. That's the kind of role I want to undertake.
How do you, I'm really quite interested in how you think that history books written 20, 25 years from now will describe the crusade that you have mounted in 1980.
I believe that many young people who can contribute for a generation or more now to the political life of our country have been turned on to the political process because of the effort that I've made, that many older people that have just given up have come back. And I think maybe that is a legacy that I would like to have history remember of me.
Ronald Reagan has settled himself into his Middleburg, Virginia home, no doubt with stacks of research material, studying up for Tuesday's debate with President Carter in Cleveland. Heidi Schulman reports that this break follows a hectic week of campaigning for Reagan.
Former Massachusetts Senator Ed Brooke endorsed Ronald Reagan at his Virginia campaign home today. Reagan remains there until late Tuesday, where he will prepare for his debate with Jimmy Carter and learn of any developments in the hostage situation. In Louisville Monday, Reagan cited the hostages in a list of failures of the Carter administration.
I don't understand why 52 Americans have been held hostage for almost a year now.
The next morning, he was even more critical.
I believe that this administration's foreign policy helped create the entire situation that made their kidnap possible. And I think the fact that they've been there that long is a humiliation and a disgrace to this country.
Reagan claimed he had ideas on how to free the hostages, but couldn't talk about them. By Wednesday, he wouldn't talk at all.
And with 52 human beings at stake, I'm not going to discuss it. I'm not going to touch on it at all.
As he stumped the South then, Reagan tried hard to change the subject, challenging Jimmy Carter's competence, charging that worsening inflation gives the president no right to seek re-election. He stepped up his television attack on Carter's handling of the economy and got a boost yesterday when new figures showed a sharp jump last month in consumer prices. Those figures and gains they believe they're making in the South have made the people in the Reagan camp more confident they can win. But they admit that if the hostages come home, there is little or nothing they can do to control the political impact. What do you do, one aide said? You welcome them home. Heidi Schulman, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign.
President Carter today accused Reagan of undergoing, quote, an election year conversion on farm issues. Speaking at an Ohio farm, Mr. Carter promised to push for a new farm program if he is reelected. He gave no firm details, except there would be fewer government regulations and some better transportation of agricultural products. Independent candidate John Anderson campaigned in Connecticut today, and while Anderson continues to maintain he can win this election, his remarks this past week indicated he's looking beyond that time. He no longer rules out a third-party move. I do not, quote, said Anderson, dismiss it as an inconceivable.
President Carter and Ronald Reagan gave reporters a break today. The two candidates stayed in place, probably boning up for Tuesday's debate in Cleveland. The president spent the day at Camp David, Mr. Reagan in Middleburg, Virginia. The race is shaping up to be a cliffhanger, with Reagan, according to NBC News, still ahead. The NBC News map shows 17 states considered to be safely held by Ronald Reagan and 8 leading toward him for a total of 237 electoral votes, a gain of 30 since last week. For President Carter, 7 states safely held, 5 leaning Democratic, for a total of 127 electoral votes. John Anderson has no states in his column. 14 states are considered toss-ups, too close to call. They represent a total of 174 electoral votes. When the 3 maps are combined, here is the picture as of this week. President Carter is trailing with 127 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan ahead with 237. 270 are needed for election. Although President Carter is not well represented on the map, many of the states considered toss-ups are those with a large number of electoral votes. And the turning point for both men may come next Tuesday night when they meet in.
Good evening. The Iranian parliament spent 6 hours discussing the fate of the American hostages today and adjourned until Wednesday without having reached any conclusions. The State Department in Washington said it was viewing the process with extreme caution, that it was making no predictions and had received no message from Tehran. The White House was saying there is no reason to believe the hostage decision in Iran has anything to do with the presidential race. But the Reagan campaign was using the hostage issue again today, not Reagan himself, but former President Ford and Reagan's running mate George Bush were insisting that politics is part of the hostage situation.
There is this question that concerns the American people, and that is whether this Khomeini government is consciously seeking to manipulate or at least influence the outcome of our country's presidential election by using these hostages for last-minute leverage after nearly a year, and frankly a year in which they could have been set free any single day. And it's no secret that the Iranians do not want to see Governor Reagan elected President of the United States. They want to play a hand in the election, and with our 52 hostages as though there's some 52 cards in a negotiating deck.
Mr. Carter's extra apparent activity to try and release the hostages does have political ramifications. I'm convinced of that. Secondly, I can't tell you what the impact will be if the hostages are released. Generally, it's accepted that the release of the hostages just before a presidential election will be beneficial to President Carter. But I must add, as I travel around the country, and this question comes up almost every occasion, there is a growing cynical attitude on the part of many Americans asking themselves, why did the hostages have to stay in Iran for 11 3/4 months?
Our latest NBC News Associated Press poll shows some skepticism about President Carter's handling of the Iranian crisis. More than a third of the likely voters we sampled said they think Mr. Carter's actions in the crisis are just designed to get him elected. The telephone poll was taken late last week among 2,400 people around the country. The likely voters in that group gave Reagan a 6-point lead. 3/4 of the likely voters have decided how they'll vote, which we think is a better way of measuring sentiment, and here again we see a 6-point lead. The error factor in polling means this could be closer than it looks. 1/4 of our sample hasn't made a final decision, but in this group, 30% are favoring Reagan, 25% are favoring Carter, and 16% favoring Anderson. We find signs, incidentally, that the number of undecided voters is quite high with the election this close. Overall, our poll figures show Reagan's lead getting a bit smaller, and you could say it's impossible to say right now who's ahead. But the figures show that the movement toward Carter, which we found 2 weeks ago, has now stopped. He would seem to need a major break in his favor, which could be provided by his debate with Reagan. Judy Woodruff, with the Carter campaign, has more on all this.
As though to prove that waiting for tomorrow night's debate hasn't brought his campaign to a standstill, the president flew to a rally in West Virginia on his way to Cleveland. With him were close aides who had spent the weekend with him at Camp David, preparing for the event they can see could make or break Mr. Carter's re-election. Also on board Air Force One was a symbol of how worried the Carter campaign is about Jewish voters, Ezer Weitzman, the former defense minister of Israel.
The man has done a lot for my country. Do I have to thank him for it or not?
Weitzman said the president had asked him to come along and denied he was interfering in American politics. In his airport speech, the president tried to put Reagan on the defensive before the debate even begins.
The problem that I've had in preparing myself for the debate is which Ronald Reagan am I going to face tomorrow evening on television. He has flip-flopped on almost every conceivable issue, depending upon what audience happens to be listening to him at a particular time.
The president once again recited a litany of what he called Reagan's switches in position, while his aides gave reporters copies of a pamphlet entitled Reagan's Flip-Flops. Arriving in Cleveland, the president said he was looking forward to the debate. Carter aides are worried about the debate. Some say privately they wish it had never come about. What concerns them is the soothing presence Reagan projects on television, an appearance that undercuts their repeated attempts to portray him as too dangerous or too insensitive to be president. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Cleveland.
Reagan got some advice today from the last man to debate Jimmy Carter, former President Gerald Ford. Ford said he told Reagan to be positive and emphasize Carter economic policies. And Ford later told reporters Reagan must be ready for a harsh attack.
Governor Reagan has to anticipate some show of the typical Carter meanness, the typical Carter vindictiveness. I can remember him in one of the debates, I can't recall which, where he pointed his finger at me and, made a big show out of it.
The Ford visit came on the third full day Reagan has spent at his Virginia home preparing for the debate. Top advisors have briefed him. Reagan has also looked at tapes of the Carter-Ford debates to study the president's tactics. And Reagan has conducted mock debates in this garage with Carter stand-ins, including Texas Senator John Tower, then watched videotapes of the sessions. Senior advisor James Baker says Reagan wins tomorrow night just by walking on stage.
We rise to the presidential level with an incumbent president, and we have access to 80 to 100 million Americans that we would otherwise never be able to have access to at one time. You've got the hostage situation, the uncertainty there, and had we not had this debate pending, that things might well have been trending in the other direction. So we're very pleased with the situation.
Reagan aides say Mr. Carter will set the tone tomorrow. If he sticks to the issues, so will Reagan. But if he brings up old Reagan quotations, they say their man has an arsenal of embarrassing things, Jimmy Carter has said. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Washington.
John Anderson, the independent candidate, got a State Department briefing last night on the hostage situation at the invitation of the White House. He said today he learned nothing new, but came away with the impression that the administration is trying to de-emphasize the possibility that the hostages will be released soon. Candidates stand in the various states. Solid red means solid for Carter. Shaded red means leaning to Carter. Ditto in blue for Reagan. White states are undecided, and they're the key. We show 14 states which are toss-ups, and that's where the election will be decided. Carter's southern base is still uncertain, and we see Reagan gaining strength in Mississippi. In the east, we see Reagan losing his lead in Vermont. In the West, we see Reagan gaining strength in Texas, but at the same time, his lead in California has narrowed somewhat. No change from last week in the Middle West. Michigan, Missouri, and Illinois still toss-ups, very important states. Ken Bodie reports from Illinois.
The city of Chicago has been like a movie set location for Ronald Reagan. His appearances in ethnic neighborhoods are designed for nationwide television, designed also to attract votes that usually go to the Democrats. That national media strategy may be helping with ethnic voters in other states, but apparently not here. Some older ethnics are for Reagan for predictable reasons.
I want a strong president, the strongest man who will fight against the communism.
But the younger generation is skeptical.
I don't trust Reagan. I don't like his policies for foreign policy, and I don't like his thoughts on women.
Jimmy Carter, under the pressures of the presidency, has done a very adequate job.
Carter's a conservative, but Reagan's a reactionary. I can't even believe Reagan's a serious candidate.
Polls in Chicago now show Reagan running fully 10 points behind Gerald Ford's totals last time. Downstate and in the suburbs, native son John Anderson is drawing more Republican votes from Reagan than Democratic votes from Carter.
Moderate to liberal to independent Republicans in this state have to understand that if they want their vote counted, it's really a race between Reagan and Carter. John Anderson can't win.
Among Democrats, presidential politics is taking a backseat to a bitter local battle between Mayor Jane Byrne and the late Mayor Daley's eldest son, Richie.
The mayor of the city of Chicago is supporting my opponent.
Republicans are confident the local bickering will help Reagan, and Jimmy Carter's strategy has been to keep the volatile, unpredictable Mayor Byrne at arm's length. In the last week before the election, Jimmy Carter will be in Illinois 3 times, Ronald Reagan at least twice. That's just how close and how important this state is. Ken Bodie, NBC News, Chicago.
Tomorrow, Cleveland will be more important to the candidates than Chicago. Cleveland is where the Carter-Reagan debate will take place. There has been much criticism of a single campaign debate 1 week before the voting, of so much at stake on what is being called a single roll of the dice. But the people of Cleveland like it just fine. Tom Pettit is there.
The first and only Carter-Reagan debate is the biggest thing to hit Cleveland since yesterday, when the Browns beat the Pittsburgh Steelers 27-26. And through the debate, Cleveland also wants to come out ahead, through publicity to counter its image of a drab industrial city, an image of declining population, a dancing Dennis Kucinich, the youngest of mayors, or Ralph Perk, who burnt his mayoral hair. The nation's first big city to have a black mayor, Cleveland is more than a third black. Cleveland is spending more than $100,000 on imagery for the debate.
When someone bum raps our city,
Cleveland is making itself so sincere you can't believe it.
So you actually have to launch yourself on a human marketing program.
Beatlemania at the Music Hall has given way to another group staging a comeback, the League of Women Voters. Carter on the left, Reagan on the right, reporters in front, Howard K. Smith moderating. Only 130 general admission tickets were made available by the League out of 900. Yet politics fans in Cleveland are interested.
I think it's going to be of a showdown nature.
I think that'll sway a lot of votes right there Tuesday.
The football game and the political process is somewhat the same. It's offense and defense.
It's a tie game with about 2 minutes to go, and Carter's got the ball.
I'd say it's a tie score, 0-0.
It's about 4th and 40, and American people are down.
All in all, Cleveland may have been the best possible city to pick for a sudden death debate. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Cleveland.
I'll be in Cleveland tomorrow for the debate, which NBC will carry live, and later tomorrow evening we'll have a special report on what happened. Until then, good night for NBC News.
Tomorrow morning on the Today.
And good evening from the Cleveland Convention Center, where the preparations for tonight's Carter-Reagan debate are underway. This is the press room, one of the biggest in the world, where a throng of press people will watch the debate on TV screens. And we have some pictures of the music hall in another part of the building where the debate will take place. 2 simple lecterns, 15 feet apart, chairs for the press panelists, backup sound systems in case the power fails. President Carter spent the day here preparing for tonight's debate. Ronald Reagan got here this afternoon. Here are 2 reports.
Reagan campaign workers saw their man off this afternoon as he ended almost 4 days of debate preparations and headed for Cleveland. Senior aides said Reagan is relaxed and anxious to debate the president, but the candidate admitted to some pre-debate jitters.
If I seem a little uptight, well, I was always that way when I ran a quarter mile, too. But a week to go, and we just hope and pray that we've done everything that could be done, and I know that all of you have. And
while Reagan concentrated on the debate, top foreign policy advisor Richard Allen was under fire. An article in today's Wall Street Journal alleges Allen used his position in the Nixon White House to obtain consulting contracts, and that he now consults for a Japanese car company at the same time Reagan is seeking unemployed auto workers. Allen's reaction was blunt.
BS, Bolshevik storytelling. Do you think it's going to hurt the campaign? I trust it won't. I pray that it won't. I don't think it will because it has no substance. Do you plan to sever any relationship as a result of all this? No.
But the Allen controversy was overshadowed by the debate. As Reagan arrived in Cleveland, aides said they'd be satisfied with a draw tonight, allowing Reagan to show he's presidential and to hold on to the lead they insist he still has. While aides have prepped Reagan intensively for the debate, there's one thing they know nothing about: their man's closing statement. Reagan worked on the statement this morning, and according to top staff, it's all his. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Cleveland.
Despite a recent bout with laryngitis, the president ignored a cold rain and began the day by jogging before dawn at a Cleveland high school. His campaign, meanwhile, treated the published allegations about Reagan advisor Richard Allen like red meat. Press Secretary Jody Powell called on Allen to make a full disclosure and on Reagan to announce before the election whether he's considering putting Allen in a high-level government job. But Powell's strongest language came in response to former President Ford's charges yesterday that Mr. Carter has manipulated the hostage crisis for political gain. Calling Ford's allegations trash, Powell said if Ford has the evidence to back them up, in Powell's words, let him stand up like a man and make them. Late this afternoon, the president walked from his hotel across the street to check over the debate hall. Aides said he had spent the day practicing his answers and boning up on points he wants to make tonight, including recent statements of Reagan's that they say are not true. One aide said Mr. Carter seemed a little nervous this morning, but was calm by later in the day. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Cleveland.
Yesterday, Israel's former defense minister, Ezer Weizmann, who quit Prime Minister Begin's government over policy differences, was riding on Air Force One as the president campaigned. Today in Israel, Begin called his cabinet together and it voted to rebuke and condemn Weizmann for involving himself in domestic American politics. We don't know if the subject of the American hostages will come up tonight in the debate. It has some political complications. Our latest NBC News Associated Press poll shows that while 34% of those polled think the president has used the crisis politically, 51% told us that the president is only doing what he believes is best for the country. We'll have more politics later in the program. Now, here's Garrett Utley.
With John Chancellor in New York, and tonight's special segment, the presidency and the pocketbook.
Good evening. On the day after the Carter-Reagan debate in Cleveland, there were all kinds of verdicts being made today on who did better, and they ranged from neither to both. Understandably, both campaigns are putting the best face on things, both claiming that their candidate did better with the large and possibly decisive numbers of undecided voters. We have two reports.
Leaving Cleveland this morning, the president had a message for anyone who thought Reagan had come across better in the debate.
I think the issues are more important than the performance.
Next stop, a town meeting in Pittsburgh, where Mr. Carter picked up where he left off last night, trying to paint Reagan as dangerous on the issue of nuclear arms control.
His position has been that if Libya, a terrorist nation, or Iraq, or other countries like Pakistan, South Africa, want to have an atomic bomb, it's none of our business. For people who care about controlling terrorism, that is the ultimate terrorist threat.
The president said the control of nuclear weapons is the most important issue in this campaign, and he accused Reagan of misrepresenting his own position. Arriving in Rochester, New York, Mr. Carter was asked about a report from Iran that prospects for the release of the hostages look better. The president seemed to be optimistic.
I talked to the State Department earlier this morning, and I think I won't comment now. But are you encouraged, sir? That's fine. I'd rather wait till later.
Is that why you're in such a good mood?
The president is visibly more relaxed today than he was on the stage with Governor Reagan last night. Since there's no way to know yet for sure which man helped himself the most, it's likely that the president is simply relieved that the debate that many of his advisors never wanted in the first place is finally behind him. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Rochester, New York.
The Reagan camp was charged up this morning. Lifted by a private poll, aides said showed Reagan won the debate, 45% to 34%. The candidate set the tone.
I feel just great. Had a good night's sleep and never felt better, and we're off now for a hard week of campaigning.
Where do you think this debate leaves the campaign now?
Well, I think it leaves it in very good shape.
As Reagan headed for Texas, aides said he showed last night he's a good alternative to a failed president. On the issues, one advisor thought Reagan demonstrated a grasp of facts. Surprisingly so, he said, considering Mr. Carter was supposed to blow him out on substance. And aides felt Reagan's style reassured voters he is not a dangerous man. There was one criticism. Aides said Reagan spent too much time defending himself, especially on the Equal Rights Amendment. This afternoon, a big rally in Houston, complete with cheerleaders, astronauts, and another former movie star, Roy Rogers. Reagan hit the theme he will emphasize through the election, Jimmy Carter's competence.
They claim that, quote, no one can match their record. Well, given 12.7% inflation, 7.5% unemployment, the doubling of fuel prices, what American president would want to match their record?
Reagan candidates say their debate goal was to win over the undecideds, but that from now on they'll concentrate on getting out their supporters. So Reagan will spend most of these final days in the suburbs of the industrial north, where he thinks this election will be decided. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Texas.
John Anderson, the candidate who wasn't there in Cleveland, is among the critics of the presidential debate, and Bob Jameson has that story.
And plan to do it or make it available.
John Anderson believes the Cleveland debate would have been better if he had been included.
I thought it was shallow. I thought it was a shallow performance. Certainly, neither one took the opportunity to present, I think, the kind of concrete, specific programs as they related either to the domestic economy or to foreign policy.
At a rally under balloons and confetti, Anderson said it was probably his fault he wasn't included. Noting President Carter's reference to his daughter Amy during the debate, Anderson said he probably should have pleaded with her.
I am sure that any little 8-year-old girl with whom her daddy sits down to talk about the dangers of nuclear proliferation and limiting nuclear war, if I could have gotten Amy's ear, I could have said, honey, you just tell your daddy it's important for the American people to hear John Anderson's ideas on nuclear proliferation, too.
Speaking seriously, Anderson said the debate did little more than freeze the support for Carter and Reagan and further confuse the undecided voters he is pursuing. Bob Jameson, NBC News, with the Anderson campaign in Philadelphia.
What happened in the Cleveland Convention Center last night, the debate, may have been the biggest thing to happen there since the Republicans nominated Cal Coolidge in 1924. Tom Pettit has some thoughts on it all.
More people, more viewers, if you include children, watched the debate last night than voted for president in 1976. Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter were seen by an estimated 105 to 120 million people, if you include children, which Carter did.
I had a discussion with my daughter Amy the other day before I came here to ask her what the most important issue was. She said she thought nuclear weaponry.
Reagan adopted the posture of Marcus Welby, M.D., fighting Carter's caffeine.
Sometimes think it's like the witch doctor that gets mad when a good doctor comes along with a cure that'll work.
Who won? The reviews sounded as if they were written by boxing writers. New York Times, no knockout blow. Washington Post, Carter on points but no KO. What of those tens of millions of TV viewers? At the J. Kennerly home in suburban Springfield, Illinois, Carol Kennerly had been disappointed in the earlier Reagan-Anderson debate.
I wanted Carter and Reagan to be squaring off a lot earlier.
Last night, she was pushed to a decision.
I clearly believe that we ought to go with Carter.
Bill Ridley stuck with
Ronald Reagan,
but Marilyn Eimel agreed with the commentators.
I don't think anybody won the debate.
The host, Mr. Kennerly, said she got that right.
Sure. I don't have a candidate. I didn't after the last one, and I still don't have one.
From the Kennerly's basement rec room across the nation, couples will replay the debate and tell each other who won, until someone does. Tom Pettit, NBC.
Good evening. With the election just 5 days away, Ronald Reagan lost his senior foreign policy advisor today. Richard Allen withdrew from the presidential campaign because of published allegations that he had misused his position in the Nixon White House some years ago for personal gain. The Reagan campaign says it still has full confidence in Allen, but wants to ensure that his problem doesn't become an issue. More from Chris Wallace.
Governor. Yesterday, Reagan called the Allen controversy much ado about nothing. But this morning, his position had changed. Asked whether he was going to fire Allen, Reagan said he was waiting for an investigation by Chief of Staff Ed Meese.
Well, this is going to depend on what I hear. I haven't heard yet.
In fact, Reagan had already decided Allen must go. And after talking with Meese, Allen announced he was stepping aside to remove himself as a campaign issue.
And we're wondering whether you were pressured.
Oh, we were, of course not pressured. I would always do what's right for the governor and for the campaign. And I think in these 5 days, only 5 more days of the campaign, I decided it was the right thing.
Allen was considered the top choice for Reagan's national security advisor. But a newspaper story this week alleged that while working in the Nixon White House, he leaked secret trade information to a Japanese businessman for private gain. A statement issued by Meese said allegations Allen acted improperly are untrue, and that he continues to have Reagan's full confidence. But as Reagan campaigned through the South, A top advisor said the candidate had not known about the charges and was concerned Mr. Carter might make them an issue. Reagan did not replace Allen, and aide said he might be part of a new administration. In an interview, Reagan called the timing of the charges suspicious, but hedged on whether he still has full confidence in Allen.
I have no reason not to have, and I won't make any further comments on it because I think there is an effort being made to make it an issue of the campaign.
Aides say Allen was let go to get past the issue quickly. One staffer describing it as a burden we don't need at this point. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in New Orleans.
A burden President Carter may not need is a new report on his brother Billy. It was written in the Department of Justice, and it says, according to Washington sources, that the president was uncooperative during the department's investigation of Billy Carter's Libyan ties. Some Republicans quickly called for the report to be published. Two reports on this.
The week before his renomination at the Democratic Convention, President Carter pledged to cooperate fully with any investigations of Billy Carter's dealings with Libya.
When questions of propriety are raised, I want to make sure they're answered fully. When the questions concern me, I want to answer them myself.
But according to a report to the Senate by the Justice Department's chief internal investigator, Michael Shaheen, President Carter, in Shaheen's words, has been remarkably uncooperative. Congressional sources familiar with the report say the president this month scheduled and then canceled 3 interviews with Justice Department investigators. So Shaheen warned he may compel the president to testify. Late today, the White House issued a statement denying that President Carter has been uncooperative. The White House said he canceled the interviews only because an examination of his records on the matter had not been completed. When it is completed, the statement said, the interview with the president will be promptly scheduled. Neither the Justice Department nor the Senate will release the report, claiming it will compromise the investigation. But Senate Republicans have charged that the administration wants to keep the report under wraps until after the election because the information would be politically damaging to President Carter. Carol Simpson, NBC News, at the Capitol.
In Michigan late today, the president brushed aside charges that he had delayed his testimony in the investigation of his brother.
We cooperated.
Press Secretary Jody Powell said appointments were canceled only at the request of the Justice Department and said today's news stories misrepresent the Justice report. Powell charged the report was leaked by Republicans on Capitol Hill in a deliberate attempt to counteract publicity about the resignation of Reagan advisor Richard Allen. The rest of the president's day was spent wooing Democrats. This morning in Philadelphia, first with Polish Americans, then with a Jewish organization. On to New York City and the traditional pre-election garment workers rally, where the president accused Reagan of being insensitive to working people. Later, Michigan, where the president promised unemployed auto workers that after the election, he will meet with the Prime Minister of Japan to try to persuade the Japanese to cut back auto shipments to the U.S. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Saginaw, Michigan.
Tonight we have the last in our series of special segments on the different approaches President Carter and Ronald Reagan take to the presidency. This one is about work habits. We know quite a bit about both men, how Mr. Carter works almost all the time with attention to every detail, how Reagan avoids small details, concentrating mainly on big decisions. There are strengths and weaknesses in each technique, and they are very different. On January 20th, either Jimmy Carter will take the oath for a second term as president, or Ronald Reagan will take the oath and move into the Oval Office, which means that either Carter, the workaholic, or Reagan, the chairman of the board, will be in charge. James Fallows was once a Carter speechwriter. He disagreed with Carter, but supports him today. He knows how Jimmy Carter does the job.
He is man who pushes himself very hard. He gets in the office early. He doesn't have any patience with wasting time. He plows through the paper. He is renowned for reading everything that's put before him. What Carter is good at is the things that are within his personal control, making decisions about things, choosing options today, etc. When it comes to making other people do things, I think he's not so good.
As governor of California, Reagan often worked the 9 to 5:30 shift, very much the chairman of the board. Robert Finch, Reagan's lieutenant governor, still a supporter.
In fact, he'd come through the office once even my offices were down at the other end of the Capitol. He'd stick his head in and say, "Come on, go on home to your wives," or "Let's get out of here." He consciously paces himself. He delegates. Well, I think the only recent style that I can think of that would fit from a presidential standpoint, the presidents I've known, would probably come closest to Eisenhower.
That's not Jimmy Carter's style.
He would insist to an extraordinary degree on having all the relevant facts presented before him, all the different points of view that he might properly consider. If there's going to be a new economic package, for example, he might get a decision memo that was 60, 80, 100 pages long.
As governor, Ronald Reagan wanted his decision memos to be just 1 page long.
And then he would ask for the further information. And his insistence on keeping it to a single page per issue, I think, did more to keep the desk uncluttered than anything else.
Often, there would be checklists of, again, 60, 80, 100 points, decisions that people wanted him to make along the way, and he'd check each one, yes, no, maybe, see me, sees do, sees big, and go through and on each point render his decisions.
He is not a detail man in the sense that I suspect what I've heard President Carter is he expects the staff to perform well. If the details are not handled, I've heard him give a pretty good chewing out to some of the staff.
Reagan's people say he likes to round table decisions, their word, to talk things out, ask questions, and then without much agonizing, decide. While Carter often reaches his decisions alone in his small study near the Oval Office. In decision-making, the two men are quite different. In one respect, they're similar. While both men have chewed out their aides on occasion, they do not like conflicts with their staffs, and they are very loyal to old colleagues. But in almost every other executive characteristic, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan are as different as men can be. The presidential campaigning was heading today for an end-of-the-campaign peak of intensity, with a lot of states still viewed as too close to call. And our reporters traveling with the Carter and Reagan campaigns today found the mood quite different in the two camps. First, Judy Woodruff with the President's Party.
While the president campaigned across the South today, his aides revealed their polling shows Mr. Carter's momentum has been slowed over the past few days. In Lakeland, Florida, the president alluded to his problem.
Without your help, I cannot win. If the election were held today, the issue would be very much in doubt. It's a close election.
Carter aides say dashed expectations over the hostages and Reagan's performance in the debate have hurt. But the bad news only seemed to reinforce Mr. Carter's determination to portray Reagan as dangerous.
It's important for you and me to make sure Tuesday that we don't have to find out in 1981 where he wants to send American military forces next year.
The campaign saved its biggest ammunition, though, to zero in on what it claims are false statements Reagan made in the debate. The president produced a phonograph record of a speech Reagan made in the early 1960s as he traveled around the country for the American Medical Association attacking Medicare.
This is an album that was put out as a result of Mr. Reagan's campaign against Medicare. A professionally prepared effort on his part to kill Medicare. Now he flatly denies that he did so.
After the president boarded Air Force One, a loudspeaker at Plainside blared Reagan's voice from the album.
One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine.
Judy Woodruff, NBC News, with the Carter campaign in Florida.
With aides claiming a steady movement his way since the debate, Reagan looked a happy man this Halloween. A Reagan song played on the airplane speakers as the candidate bowled a pumpkin instead of the usual orange down the aisle on takeoff. Reagan seemed just as relaxed on the stump. Jumping on reports, the president has been uncooperative in a government investigation of the Billy Carter affair.
I've always had a standard belief. If there's any appearance of wrongdoing, then there ought to be a clear and open explanation for the people and an investigation.
That doesn't, ladies and gentlemen, we gotta go.
Well, he does seem to be dragging his feet.
Reagan kept attacking all day. In Pittsburgh, he said Mr. Carter came to office with no idea what to do with the presidency except enjoy it.
Jimmy Carter reminds me of a fellow who can tell you the 50 parts of an automobile and describe them and tell you what they're supposed to do, but he doesn't know how to drive the car or fix it.
Later, a rally in suburban Chicago, where Reagan must rack up big vote margins to counteract the Democrats in the city. Reagan emphasized Carter economic policies, which he called a tragedy for the American family.
He promised us he would give us a government as good as the American people. He gave us a government as good as Jimmy Carter, and that's not good enough.
Barring a break on the hostages, Reagan aides say there will be no surprises in these final days. Reagan will keep hitting the Carter record in key toss-up states. One advisor described it like a football running game. 3 yards and a cloud of dust. Chris Wallace, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Des Plaines, Illinois.
Pennsylvania is one of the key states, one of the so-called Big Nine electoral vote states, which are so important to both campaigns. Tom Pettit has gone to Pennsylvania, and this is what he found.
Jimmy Carter is losing the war for Pennsylvania's 27 electoral votes, according to knowledgeable political operatives of both parties. Carter ahead in Pittsburgh, Reagan in Wilkes-Barre. Carter slightly ahead in Philadelphia, but not enough to offset Reagan's rural and suburban muscle. Carter has made 6 visits to Pennsylvania, with one more Sunday night, total of 7. Ditto Reagan, 7. Bush will have been here 10 times, Mondale 8, but seemingly for Carter not enough. When Carter departs Philadelphia Monday, he will leave a grim scene.
Dziękuję.
Polish Americans endorsed Reagan, rejected Carter. Carter crowds were small, Reagan's larger. Democrats in Philadelphia hampered by abscam and factionalism. Republicans driven by passion and ecstasy about the Tuesday night debate in Cleveland.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
The battle for Pennsylvania is always decided here in Philadelphia. Republicans expect Democrats to win, but with a small margin, not a big one. Drew Lewis, Republican National Committee.
We lose Philadelphia by less than 150,000 votes. We've carried Pennsylvania.
Bill Green, Mayor, Democrat.
We'll have a very sizable victory in Philadelphia.
If Green is right that Carter will win Philadelphia by 200,000, then Carter will win Pennsylvania. Green earlier and accurately said Kennedy would win the primary. In pursuit of the recalcitrant black vote, Carter persuaded Senator Kennedy to join him Sunday night in Philly. The question is, if Carter cannot do it alone, can Kennedy and black personalities jack up Philadelphia's Democratic black turnout? If not, Pennsylvania, which went for Kennedy in 60 and Carter in 76, will go for Reagan in 80. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Philadelphia.
The West Europeans who have so many military and political ties with the United States are watching the American election. The president's foreign policy has not been popular in Europe, and Ronald Reagan to most European leaders is simply an unknown quantity. Jim Bitterman reports on The View from Europe.
In Europe, you don't have to be an expert to worry about what the next 4 years will bring in the way of American foreign policy, to be concerned about who will be the commander in charge of America's military might. Along the West German border, where American soldiers patrol the front line of what is literally the Iron Curtain, people have a great deal of interest in what kind of president America will have during the next 4 years. In the village of Ehrenberg-Seifertz, less than a mile from East Germany, Dietmar Krenzer's barber shop is easily within range of Soviet guns and atomic weapons. When the talk turns to American politics, Krenzer says, with his customers in agreement, whoever it is, he has to be tough, a lot tougher in order to stand up to the Soviets. In the salons and studios of those who follow American elections carefully, the candidates are clearly in mind, if not clearly understood. It is not just the political cartoonists who see Ronald Reagan as the cowboy, perhaps too quick on the draw, who view Jimmy Carter, the dangerous gambler willing to take high risks to gain public approval. Many European opinion makers believe the characterizations too.
They are a bit surprised, probably to be the predominant feeling among the French at least, that the choice for the American people is between those two people.
The prestigious British journal, The Economist, recently took the highly unusual step of editorializing in favor of one candidate over the other. We talked with many European leaders, the editor said, and they told us that while there were risks with Reagan, there were even greater risks with Carter. The Economist agreed with them. On the streets of Europe this fall, the American presidential candidates are hardly on the tip of everyone's tongue.
Well, there's Kennedy, and then there's the one that's a film star, and another one.
I do know. Of course I do. The film bloke, doesn't it? Carter. Booski, isn't it? His name Booski. Booski.
Jim Bitterman, NBC News, London.